I always thought camping was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a retreat from the noise of everyday life, a chance to clear your mind and reconnect with nature. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, my backpack, and the woods. But that trip, the one that changed everything, didn't turn out anything like I imagined. It started innocently enough. A weekend in the woods, alone. I had been feeling burned out from work, stressed about everything in my life. I needed to get away to recharge. I picked a spot I had been to before, a place not too far from home but secluded enough to feel like a break from the world. There was a small lake nearby, and the woods around it were thick with trees. A place to clear your head, a place to just breathe. I packed light, planning to stay 2 nights. Tent, sleeping bag, some food, and a first aid kit. I didn't think I would need much more than that. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, the weather perfect. The sun was shining, and the air was cool with just a hint of autumn. When I arrived, the site was just as I remembered it. Isolated, quiet, a small fire pit by the water's edge, a few logs to sit on, and the forest around me stretching for miles. Perfect. I set up my tent and gathered some firewood. As evening approached, I lit a small fire. The crackle of the flames was comforting, familiar. I sat back, sipping from a flask of tea, staring out at the lake. There were no sounds except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the crackling of the fire. It was almost too quiet, but I dismissed the thought. It was just the kind of solitude I had been craving. As night fell, the darkness wrapped around me like a blanket. I kept the fire burning bright, its warmth pushing back against the cold. The trees stood like silent sentinels around my campsite, their shadows stretching long and thin in the firelight. The stars overhead were clear and sharp, like tiny pinpricks in a black canvas. It was beautiful in a way that made everything else seem distant. Everything except the growing sense of unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. At first, I thought it was just the usual feeling you get when you're alone in the woods at night. The kind of awareness that makes you hyper-conscious of every sound. A branch cracking, an animal moving in the underbrush. But this time it was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but the longer I sat there, the more it grew. I tried to ignore it. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, around midnight, it happened. I heard a rustle in the trees. I froze, listening intently. It wasn't the wind. The sound was too deliberate, too slow, almost like someone or something was moving through the woods, just out of sight. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe. They were common around here. But the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I stood up, trying to make myself small and inconspicuous, just in case. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. The night felt heavier now, as though the darkness had thickened around me. The rustling stopped. Then, just as suddenly, I heard it again, this time closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and shined it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only the trunks of the tall pines, but nothing else. The rustling stopped immediately. I waited, listening. Nothing. I started to breathe a little easier, telling myself it was just the wind again, or maybe a raccoon or squirrel. I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm myself, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. The night felt oppressive, and still, I couldn't shake the thought that something was out there, watching me. I stayed up for another hour, long after the fire had burned down to embers. Every little noise made me tense, and I couldn't stop scanning the dark trees, my eyes constantly flicking toward the shadows. Eventually, exhaustion won over my anxiety, and I crawled into my tent. I kept the flashlight next to me, just in case. The walls of the tent seemed to close in around me as I lay there, staring at the faint outline of the trees through the fabric. My mind raced with thoughts, silly thoughts, irrational thoughts, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It followed me into the tent. I finally drifted off to sleep, but my rest was fitful. Every little noise made me stir, and I woke up several times during the night, my heart racing. But by morning, I had convinced myself it had all been a product of my overactive imagination. It was just the woods, nothing more. I got up early, wanting to shake off the unease and make the most of the day. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the lake. I took a deep breath of fresh, cool air and decided to go for a hike around the area to clear my head. The woods were beautiful in the morning light, peaceful, calm, the perfect escape. But something was off. As I walked along the edge of the lake, I saw something unusual. There was a small clearing up ahead, and in the middle of it was a large rock. Something about it caught my attention. As I got closer, I realized there was something scratched into the surface of the rock. Curiosity tugged at me, and I approached it slowly. The markings were crude but unmistakable. Scratches, deep gouges, carved into the stone in some kind of pattern. They were jagged and uneven, as though made by something with sharp claws. The marks formed no recognizable shape, but they were unnerving, like something had tried to carve out a message, or perhaps just vent some kind of primal aggression. I backed away from the rock, my skin crawling. This wasn't something I had seen on any of my previous trips. I decided it was time to head back to camp, to pack up and leave. Whatever had made those marks didn't feel natural. But as I turned around to walk back, I froze. The rustling sound, it was back, closer this time. And it wasn't just one noise, it was several, like multiple things moving through the underbrush. I felt my stomach drop. I had been hearing it since the night before, but now it was unmistakable. I wasn't alone. I stood perfectly still, listening intently. The sounds came from behind me, just out of sight, and then nothing. Absolute silence. My mind raced. I was certain now. Whatever it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I slowly began to walk back to camp, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't know what was out there, but I had a feeling that I didn't want to find out. When I reached my campsite, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying not to panic. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't stop myself from looking over my shoulder every few seconds. Every sound seemed amplified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been following me in the woods was still out there. I loaded everything into my car and got in, slamming the door behind me. I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. As I drove away, the tension slowly began to ease, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in those woods, waiting. I had always loved camping. The smell of pine trees, the sound of a crackling campfire, and the feeling of being miles away from the noise and chaos of the city always gave me a sense of peace. But this trip, to a remote campsite deep in the woods, was unlike any I'd taken before. I'd been planning the trip for months. I wanted something isolated, somewhere quiet where I could get away from the hustle and bustle. After researching online, I came across a spot deep in the wilderness, about 10 miles away from the nearest town. The campsite was so remote that only a few people even knew about it. The reviews were a mix of glowing praise and a few vague warnings about how quiet it could be out there. No one really said much beyond that, and I figured it would be an adventure. I didn't expect anything strange. After all, people camp there every year without incident, right? I packed my gear. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and some simple food. I didn't bring too much. I wanted to stay light and flexible. The hike to the campsite was tough but manageable. the path winding through thick trees, along rocky inclines, and over streams. It wasn't an easy trek, but that was part of the appeal. The deeper into the woods I went, the more I felt like I was entering a place where few had ever set foot. The first day was pleasant enough. I set up my tent by a small creek, its sound relaxing as it trickled over rocks. I started a fire, made a simple dinner, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. As the evening grew darker, the temperature dropped, and the forest around me became still, the kind of stillness that wraps you in a strange sense of isolation. No sounds of birds, no distant hum of traffic, just the fire and the gentle rustle of the trees in the wind. But as night settled in, something began to feel off. It wasn't the usual calm of nature. There was a silence too deep, too thick. No crickets, no owls hooting, no sound at all except for the occasional crackle of the fire. I tried to push it from my mind. Maybe it was just the remote location. Maybe I wasn't used to the complete absence of sound. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and sat back, watching the flames dance. The smoke curled up into the air, carrying with it a faint, earthy scent. I was just beginning to feel comfortable again when I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking somewhere in the trees. I froze. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the usual shuffle of small creatures. It was heavier, more deliberate, something larger. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the edge of the forest where the trees met the open space around my campfire. Nothing, no movement, just shadows cast by the firelight. But then, another snap, this time closer. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, slowly, trying to keep my movements calm. I reached for the flashlight by my side, turned it on, and swung the beam into the darkness. The light sliced through the trees, illuminating patches of underbrush, but there was nothing there, just the shifting shapes of the forest in the glow of my light. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, that uneasy feeling of being watched. Couldn't shake it. I forced myself to sit back down, trying to act like nothing was wrong. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear or something, wandering through the woods. I kept the fire burning brightly, throwing more wood on to make sure the flames stayed high. The last thing I wanted was to sit in the dark with only the faint glow of embers. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't stop glancing toward the tree line. The night seemed deeper somehow, as if the darkness were closing in around me. My mind kept racing, replaying every noise, every movement, trying to make sense of it. The air felt thick and heavy now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, I heard it again. A sound, this time unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I stood up again, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't an animal. I was sure of it now. No animal moved like that. This was someone deliberately walking toward my camp. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and get the hell out of there, but I didn't know which direction to go. The trail was back in the opposite direction, and it would take at least an hour to get out of the woods. If I ran, I might end up getting lost. The footsteps grew closer, the sound of crunching leaves and breaking twigs unmistakable now. I could see the shadows shifting between the trees. Something or someone was out there. I quickly grabbed the hatchet from my gear, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was going to do with it if someone approached, but I had to be ready for whatever was coming. My breath came in shallow gasps as I listened, every sound amplified in the silence of the night. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear any movement, any indication of where the person or thing might be. But there was nothing. The forest was silent again. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, waiting. Time seemed to stretch, and every moment felt like an eternity. I kept telling myself that it was just an animal, Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I turned around and hurriedly stuffed everything I could into my backpack. The firelight flickered as I glanced back, my mind racing. The forest seemed alive now, filled with things I couldn't see. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt the weight of the night closing in. That's when I heard it, a low guttural growl, not from an animal but from something deeper. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods, my hands shaking so badly that the beam flickered erratically. For a second, I thought I saw something, a figure, standing just outside the light's reach, hidden in the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. My breathing came in short, panicked gasps. I was on the verge of full-on panic now. I had to leave, I had to get out of there, but I was too scared to move. I heard the footsteps again, louder now, moving quickly, coming closer. But then, just as suddenly, they stopped. I stood frozen for a long time, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing. The forest, the night, everything was eerily quiet. It was like the world had just stopped moving. I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care what I left behind, what I might have missed, or what was still out there. All I knew was that I had to get back to the trail and get out of the woods as quickly as possible. I didn't stop running until I hit the main trail, and even then, I kept moving. I didn't care how dark it was, how far I had to go, or how tired I was. I just kept moving. When I finally made it to the parking lot, I didn't look back at the forest. I didn't stop to wonder if I'd imagined it all or if I was just being paranoid. I just got in my car and drove straight home, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I don't know what I heard that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with me, but I'll never forget that feeling, the one that told me I wasn't alone, and I'll never go back to those woods again. It started like any other weekend camping trip. I was excited to finally escape the city for a while, to breathe some fresh air, and to spend some time in nature. My friends and I had made these trips before, usually just a few miles off the beaten path. But this time, we decided to push further into the wilderness. We were experienced enough campers to handle it. We packed up the truck with all our gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, the works. The area we picked was deep in the woods, a place not many people ventured to. It was supposed to be peaceful and serene, a perfect spot to disconnect from everything. The closest town was miles away, and our cell phones barely had a signal. That suited us just fine, no distractions. We were all ready to just relax and enjoy the outdoors. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the treetops. The forest looked beautiful, but there was an odd sense of quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is waiting. But I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. We quickly set up camp, building a fire pit in a small clearing. The woods felt vast and untouched, and the shadows stretched long as evening settled in. As the fire crackled, we cooked some basic food, nothing fancy, just beans and sausages. We shared stories, laughed, and joked around, and for a while, everything felt normal. But there was something strange about the woods. The air was dense, as if it held its breath, waiting for something. I could hear the occasional rustle in the trees, but it was different from the usual sounds of wildlife. There was no wind, but branches shifted in the distance, swaying as if someone or something was walking among them. I shook the thought from my head. It's just the trees, I told myself, though a knot of unease began to grow in my stomach. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to close in, the darkness becoming a thick, impenetrable blanket. The fire was the only source of light, and it flickered and danced in a way that made the shadows play tricks on our eyes. I kept seeing shapes moving just beyond the edge of the light, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. My friends were too caught up in their conversation to notice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. The air was cooler now, and I needed to stretch my legs. I grabbed a flashlight and wandered away from the camp, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of ancient trees, their bark rough and twisted. The trail was overgrown, but it seemed to beckon me forward, as if urging me to explore. I kept walking, my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs beneath me. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. I could hear my breath, shallow and quick, echoing in the stillness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the occasional rustle of the trees anymore. It was the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck, cold and unblinking. I turned quickly, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing, just the forest, as still as ever. But then, I noticed something. Far off in the distance, just beyond the reach of my light, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another tree or a shadow cast by the flickering fire, but it stood too straight, too still. I froze, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. I held my breath, unsure whether to approach or run back to camp. For what felt like an eternity, I just stood there, staring at the figure. Then, without warning, it moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, it stepped back into the shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter. I should have turned around and gone back immediately, but instead, I took a step forward. I moved closer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. But by the time I reached the spot where I'd seen the figure, it was gone. The forest was silent again, the air heavy with the stillness that seemed to seep into my very bones. I glanced around, my eyes scanning every corner of the woods, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I was being irrational, I thought. There were no people out here. No one else could be this deep in the woods. I was just seeing things. Or maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, blending into the dark. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned and began walking back to camp, but now every rustle, every creak of the trees seemed amplified. My mind raced, conjuring up images of predators, of people lurking just out of sight. I quickened my pace, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically as I moved. When I finally returned to camp, I tried to push the feeling away. My friends were sitting around the fire, laughing, and I forced myself to smile as I sat down. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. Every so often, my eyes would dart to the edge of the woods, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. The night wore on, and eventually, one by one, my friends went to bed. I stayed by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. But then, just as I thought I might finally fall asleep, I heard something. It was faint at first, a low sound that seemed to come from far away. A thud, followed by another. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was coming from the woods. I could hear it clearly now, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the dry underbrush. There was no wind, no other noise to explain it away. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I waited, listening intently. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the light. My breath came faster now, the panic rising in my chest. I stood up, my legs shaky, and scanned the woods once more. This time, I could hear the sounds more clearly. It was closer now, just on the other side of the camp. I was about to call out to my friends, but then I saw it, movement in the trees. A figure, pale and gaunt, stepped out from behind a large tree. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out the shape of a person. A man, I thought, but his clothes were torn, his hair wild and unkempt. His eyes were wide and vacant, as though he wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The man didn't move toward us, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, watching us from the darkness. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, my mind racing for an explanation. Who was he? Why was he out here in the middle of nowhere? I wanted to yell, to wake my friends, but my voice caught in my throat. The man didn't seem threatening, at least not at first, but something about the way he stood there, motionless, felt wrong. After a few long seconds, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared, as if he had never been there at all. The footsteps stopped. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to worry them or seem crazy. I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, but the tension in the air was thick. The rest of the night was restless. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, my mind racing. Every creak, every rustle seemed amplified in the silence, but nothing else happened. The next morning, the sun rose clear and bright. Everything seemed normal again. My friends and I packed up, laughing and joking like we always did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong the night before. It wasn't just the man in the woods, but the way the forest had felt. Too still, too quiet, as though something was waiting for us to leave. I never saw the man again, and we didn't talk about what happened. Maybe it was just a dream, I thought, but something inside me knew better. That day, as we drove out of the woods and back to civilization, I looked back one last time. The forest stood silent, as if it were hiding something in its depths. I don't know who the man was. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was a wanderer. Maybe he was something more. But I know this. I've never gone back to those woods again, and I don't plan to. I had always loved the idea of camping. There was something calming about it. The feeling of being far away from everything, surrounded only by trees and the sounds of nature. It was a way to disconnect from the world, to escape the pressures of everyday life and just exist in the moment. So, when I decided to take a solo trip into the woods, I thought it would be the perfect getaway. I chose a campsite deep in a forest about 3 hours outside of town. A little remote, not many people knew about it, but that's exactly why I picked it. I didn't want any distractions. No cell service, no noisy neighbors, just me and the wilderness. The directions to the site were vague, a mixture of GPS and some old hand-drawn maps that the ranger station had given me. They said it would take about an hour's hike to get there from the trailhead, but I figured I could handle it. I'd done it before, and it wasn't like I was out of shape. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, food, a stove, and a first aid kit. Simple stuff. I set off early in the morning, the crisp air and the promise of adventure making my heart race just a little faster. The first few miles were easy, the trail well-worn and clear. The trees towered over me, their branches casting long shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped above, and every now and then, I'd hear the rustle of a squirrel or something smaller darting through the underbrush. The hike was peaceful, almost meditative. The only real sound, aside from the birds, was the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. I passed a few other hikers early on, but as I got farther in, the trail grew quieter. The thick trees seemed to swallow up any noise, and before long, I was all alone. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky. The clearing I found was small but perfect, nestled between a few large boulders, with a fire pit already in place. There was a small stream running nearby. The sound of water bubbling over rocks was soothing. I set up my tent and unpacked my gear. The solitude felt nice, and I felt a sense of pride. I had managed to find this spot all on my own, and it was perfect. I spent the evening gathering firewood and getting the stove ready for some simple dinner. It was a quiet, peaceful night. I watched the stars begin to appear, the sky darkening to an inky blue. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and the night air was cool but not cold. I ate my dinner slowly, savoring the silence and the feeling of being far away from everything. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something strange. The forest, usually so full of life, felt eerily still. The birds had stopped chirping, and there was no sign of any other animals moving around. It was as if everything had gone silent, all at once. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the time of night, but I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was off. I stoked the fire and sat closer to it, trying to keep warm as the temperature dropped. I had no reason to be scared, I told myself. There were no stories of dangerous animals around here, just deer and smaller creatures, and maybe the occasional bear, but they didn't come this close to human campsites. I laughed at myself for getting paranoid. Then I heard something, a rustle. It was faint at first, coming from the trees behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off. The wind could have been moving the branches, making them scrape against each other. But then it happened again, a little louder this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the wind. This was something else. My eyes scanned the tree line, trying to pick out any movement. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, and shone it in the direction of the noise. Nothing. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to sit back down. It was probably a deer or something. They were skittish animals, especially at night. I wasn't in any danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, certain that I'd heard something moving outside the tent. The wind, maybe, a small animal, but I couldn't be sure. My mind was racing, and sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke to the soft glow of the sun filtering through the trees. I felt groggy, but the sense of unease was still with me. I went about my morning routine, boiling water for coffee and stretching out my stiff muscles. The world around me was alive again. Birds were singing, and I could hear the distant rush of the stream. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal, but there was still a lingering tension in the air. I decided to take a short walk around the area, just to get a better feel for the surroundings. The woods seemed familiar, but also different. The trees were older than I'd expected, the trunks thick and twisted. The ground was uneven in places, covered in layers of fallen leaves and moss. I ventured a little farther than I should have, pushing through dense underbrush, following a narrow trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. That's when I found it, or rather, when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I got closer, I realized it was real. A small structure, barely visible through the trees, an old, dilapidated shed. It was half covered in ivy and moss, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging. It looked abandoned, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a horror movie, not out here in the middle of nowhere. I stood frozen, staring at it. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no obvious path leading to it. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong here. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, careful not to make too much noise. The door of the shed was ajar just slightly, enough that I could see inside. It was dark, too dark to make out any details, but there was something off. Something about the way the shadows inside moved, almost like they were alive. I took a step back, suddenly feeling very exposed. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know why, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't just an abandoned shed. It was something else. I turned and began walking quickly back toward my campsite, every instinct telling me to leave, to get out of this place as fast as I could. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I packed up my things, eager to get out of the woods and away from whatever I had found. But the hike back to the trailhead felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer together, the sounds of the birds and animals muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here. As I drove away from the forest, the unease lingered, but I didn't look back. I'd had enough. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized something strange. When I got home and unpacked my gear, I found a small, old key in the pocket of my jacket. I couldn't remember where it had come from, but I knew one thing: it didn't belong to me. I never did find out what that shed was, or who it might have belonged to. And as for the key, I never used it. Some things are better left locked away, I guess. I had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. The weekend was supposed to be a break from the busy life I was leading, a chance to escape into nature, to unwind by the fire, and to enjoy the solitude of the woods. No phone signal, no emails, no deadlines, just me, my gear, and the great outdoors. But that weekend turned out to be something I didn't expect. It started on a Friday evening. I arrived at the site after a long drive through winding roads, passing small towns, and barely seeing anyone on the way. The campsite was tucked deep in the woods, far away from any real civilization. The perfect place for peace and quiet. It was remote, which was exactly what I wanted. Just the thought of the isolation, the sound of the trees swaying, the crackle of the fire. It was everything I needed. I had been here before, though not many times. It was a familiar sight, a place I liked because it was simple. There was no modern interference, just dirt paths, old trees, and a few tent pads scattered around the area. I always chose the furthest one, the one that was the hardest to reach. It was an effort to get there, but that was the point. It was worth it. Setting up my tent took a while, especially since I was alone. I had to make sure everything was secure, the rain fly, the stakes, the guy lines. After I finished, I got a fire going and made a quick dinner. I was on my own for the night. No company, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of crickets. As the sun began to set, the forest started to change. The shadows deepened. The sounds of animals grew louder, a reminder of how alive the forest was even in the dark. But for me, it was soothing. I didn't feel afraid, not at all. In fact, I was starting to relax, feeling the stress of the city life slip away. I ate, enjoyed the fire, and watched the stars slowly appear. It wasn't until later that night, when the wind started to pick up, that things began to feel off. At first, it was just a change in the air. A little colder, a little heavier. I thought it might rain, but the sky was clear, and there was no sign of clouds moving in. The trees swayed more than usual, their branches creaking and groaning under the pressure of the wind. It didn't bother me at first. It was just nature doing its thing. But then I started to notice something strange. The wind didn't sound right. It wasn't the usual sound of rustling leaves or branches. It was almost like whispers. At least that's how it felt. There was a rhythm to it, like a group of voices, just beyond my hearing. The hairs on the back of my neck started to rise, but I shook it off. My mind was just playing tricks on me. There was no one out here. I was alone. But the wind, it kept picking up, growing louder and more intense. It felt like it was circling around me, pulling at the edges of my camp. I stood up from my chair, walking to the edge of the firelight and listening. The rustling was louder now, more distinct. It wasn't just wind anymore. There was something moving, something larger than just the wind. The forest had become still except for this sound. It wasn't a normal animal sound either. Couldn't place it. There was a kind of shift in the air, a tension. Felt like something was watching me. I reached for my flashlight, feeling uneasy. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to see. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. But as I swung the beam of light across the trees, the beam faltered for a second, and I saw it. Movement. A shadow darting between the trunks, too fast for my eyes to fully focus on it. I froze. My heart was pounding, but I didn't dare move. I stood there, listening, my breath coming short. The rustling stopped suddenly. Everything went dead quiet. The air felt thick, like the forest had suddenly held its breath. I waited. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal. But the silence stretched on, longer than it should have. I didn't want to sit back down by the fire. I couldn't relax anymore. My instincts were telling me to leave, to pack up and drive home. But I had come here to escape. I had wanted to be alone. I wasn't going to let fear take that away from me. Still, every time I looked toward the trees, I felt that same cold sensation creeping up my spine. My mind raced, thinking of all the animals that lived here. Deer, wolves, coyotes. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe it was something else. I decided to walk around the campsite, to move away from the firelight and see if I could find anything. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I kept hearing that odd rustling noise, like something following me. Not animals, not leaves. Something else, something deliberate. I stopped for a moment, listening. The hair on my arms stood on end. I called out, half expecting an answer, half hoping I was just being paranoid. But there was no response, just the stillness of the night. I moved back toward the fire, my feet crunching the dried leaves underfoot. When I reached my tent, I was more anxious than I had been all day. The light from the fire flickered and danced, but it wasn't enough to chase away the feeling that something was out there. I made sure to lock my tent door and pull the zipper tight, almost instinctively. I didn't want to be exposed, not even for a second. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. It wasn't long before I heard it. The faintest of noises, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and soft. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from, but they were close, too close. I felt my heart thump in my chest. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps were moving around the camp, circling the tent. I could feel them. Someone was out there and they were just watching. I tried to remind myself that it could be another camper, but the idea made my stomach churn. No one else was supposed to be in the area. The site was remote and I was the only one here. I lay there for what felt like an eternity. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Absolute silence. Then, as if in answer to my fears, a loud crack echoed through the woods. A branch breaking under weight, too close for comfort. I jumped, my heart racing. Someone was out there. Someone who had no business being in the woods at this hour. I grabbed my flashlight again, feeling the weight of it in my hand, but I didn't want to shine it. I didn't want to give away my position. Instead, I stayed still, listening. The footsteps resumed. They were moving closer now, not to the tent, but around it as if circling, probing. I could feel the tension in the air, a palpable force. It was like whatever was out there was toying with me, testing my resolve. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and I could hear something else now, breathing. Heavy, deliberate breaths, not my own. Someone or something was out there, standing just beyond the light. My pulse raced in my throat. I had to make a decision. I could sit here, terrified, waiting for whatever was out there to do something, or I could leave. I grabbed my things in a rush, no longer caring about the neatness of my setup. I was running now. The urge to get out was overwhelming. I unzipped the tent door and quickly darted out into the woods, flashlight in hand. The beams of light cut through the darkness, but all I could see were trees. No figure, no person, no shadow. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. There, I paused, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. I had no idea what had happened in those woods, but the feeling of being watched, the footsteps, the breathing, I couldn't shake it. I didn't care if I looked foolish. I wasn't going back to that campsite. The drive back home was a blur, my mind racing through every detail, trying to make sense of what had happened. But nothing made sense. There were no answers. Later, I learned that the area I had been camping in had a reputation. It was known for strange occurrences. People said it was just stories. Rumors, really. But after that night, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to it. I never went back to that campsite, and I never went camping alone again. The forest might have seemed peaceful at first, but I learned the hard way that there's a difference between the calm of nature and the silence of something watching you. I've always loved the outdoors. The smell of the forest, the quiet stillness that comes over you when you step away from civilization. There's nothing like it. That's why I decided to take a solo camping trip up in the mountains. The plan was simple. Pitch my tent, relax by the fire, maybe do some fishing, and enjoy a few days of complete solitude. I didn't think anything could go wrong. I had all the gear: a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, a portable stove, and a few days' worth of food. The weather was perfect, clear skies, no rain in the forecast. I drove up the winding mountain roads, the engine of my old truck rumbling under me, and parked at the trailhead. The only other car, there was an old Jeep with a couple of backpacks strapped to the roof, but it was empty. Perfect. No one around to disturb my peace. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started down the trail. The forest was thick, tall trees arching over me, their trunks covered in moss. The air was crisp, and the ground was soft under my boots, the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves filling my nostrils. I was a few hours into the hike when I finally found a good spot, a clearing near a small creek. It was quiet, secluded, the perfect place to set up camp. Setting up the tent was easy. I'd done it 100 times before. I built a fire, carefully arranged the logs, and then went to work on my dinner. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The fire crackled as the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air, and I let myself relax. It felt good to be away from everything, to be in nature's embrace. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a slight rustling in the bushes, an animal moving in the underbrush, perhaps. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But then the sounds kept going and they felt closer. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, I was alone in the wilderness. There were animals out there, sure, but I wasn't in any danger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pushed the thought aside, retreating to my tent. The fire outside crackled on, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, trying to drift off. But every little sound, crunching leaves, a snap of twigs, kept pulling me back into a state of half-wakefulness. It was a peaceful night, but the forest was alive with noises, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. always loved camping. There's something about the isolation, the peace of being surrounded by nature, and the quiet that felt like a refuge. My best friend and I used to go camping every summer, exploring new spots and testing our limits in the wild. This year, I decided to go alone. It wasn't because I didn't have anyone to join me, but rather I was craving some time to myself, a break from the chaos of everyday life. So, I packed my gear, grabbed my tent, and headed out to a remote site I had read about online. The drive took longer than I expected. The path was narrow and winding, with trees crowding both sides of the road. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, the shadows growing longer as the sun began to dip behind the mountain range in the distance. By the time I arrived, the last light of the day was fading, and I was starting to feel the cool bite of the evening air. The campsite was small and quiet, with only a couple of other cars parked by the entrance, but they didn't seem like they were still there. It felt like I had the whole place to myself. I unloaded my gear from the car, tent, sleeping bag, food, and water, and began setting up camp. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the gentle wind and the distant call of birds settling for the night. As I finished setting up my tent, I realized I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. There was no sign of the other campers, and no one had come through the trail I had just walked. A strange feeling of unease started to creep in, but I shook it off. It was just me being paranoid. I hadn't been camping alone in a while, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. The night settled in quickly, and I lit a small fire. I roasted some marshmallows, sat by the flames, and stared at the sky. It was beautiful, clear, with a million stars spread out like a canvas. As I sat there, though, a thought kept nagging at me. It was the silence. The forest was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. Usually, in the woods at night, you can hear animals moving around, insects buzzing, leaves rustling as creatures scurry across the ground. But there was nothing. Not even the occasional breeze disturbed the stillness. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a quiet night. But as the hours wore on, the unease deepened. It wasn't just silence. It was an unnatural kind of stillness, as though everything in the forest was holding its breath. I got up from the fire and decided to walk around the campsite a bit, stretch my legs. The ground felt soft beneath my boots, the air cold and sharp. As I wandered, my eyes kept scanning the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around several times, expecting to see someone or something, but all I saw was darkness and the faint outlines of the trees against the night sky. Still, the feeling lingered. I headed back to my fire, but as I walked toward it, I noticed something strange. There was a new set of footprints near the edge of the campsite. They weren't mine, they were much larger, and they seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. They led away from my fire and into the woods. I stood frozen, staring at them. My heart began to race. It was as though someone had been walking around my campsite without me noticing. I don't know why, but instead of packing up and leaving, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and followed the prints. The forest was dense, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The prints led to a small clearing, but there was no sign of anyone. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound of something moving in the brush behind me. My head snapped around, but there was nothing there. I stood still for a long moment, straining my ears. It was completely silent again, and for a second, I felt like I was imagining things. But the chill running down my spine told me otherwise. I turned back toward the campsite, eager to return to the safety of my fire. But as I did, I felt something shift in the air, an unsettling presence, like I wasn't alone. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it had died. But when I shook it, the light came back on, weak but steady. The walk back to the campsite felt longer than it should have. I kept hearing things, branches cracking, leaves rustling, like something was following me, just out of sight. I quickened my pace, finally reaching the campfire. The flames were low now, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing. I spent the rest of the night staring into the fire, watching the embers flicker and fade. The forest felt alive in a way that was unnerving, like it was watching me, waiting for something. I didn't sleep much, but I kept the fire going, afraid that if I let it die, something would happen. Every now and then, I would hear something, footsteps, rustling, the distant sound of a twig snapping. But each time I looked, there was nothing. When morning finally came, I packed up my things in a hurry, eager to leave. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one. I reached my car, threw my gear in the trunk, and drove off without looking back. As I passed through the winding roads, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, convinced that I would see something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me drive away. But there was nothing. I didn't go camping alone again for a long time after that. The woods had felt different that night, unnervingly empty and still. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe something was out there, just waiting for me to leave so it could come closer. The thing is, I've never been able to shake the feeling. I still think about that night every time I'm out in the wilderness, and I can't help but wonder what really happened out there. The silence, the strange footprints, the feeling of being watched. It all stays with me. But I guess that's the thing about the woods. You never really know what's out there, waiting in the shadows. It was a last-minute decision, but it had been a while since I went camping. A weekend away from everything, no work, no phone calls, no noise. Just the wilderness and me. At least that's what I thought it would be. I drove for hours deeper into the woods, the kind of place you had to drive through a long, narrow dirt road to reach. The kind of place where the air smelled fresh and clean, where the trees towered over you and blocked out most of the sky. The sun was setting by the time I found the small, secluded campsite I had planned on using. The campgrounds were nearly empty. Only a couple of tents dotted the area. Perfect, I thought. I set up my tent near a stream that ran through the woods, its gentle gurgling sound helping me feel at ease. The evening came quickly, and the sun dipped behind the trees, leaving me with nothing but the sounds of the woods. Birds were still chirping, but there was a deep quiet beneath it all, the kind you can only experience in nature. I set up my campfire, careful to keep the flame controlled. After a long day of driving and setting up camp, I was starving, so I roasted some hot dogs over the fire and ate in peace, watching the orange glow of the flames dance in front of me. As the night grew darker, the forest around me seemed to come alive. The wind rustled through the branches above, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I figured it was just the usual night creatures, deer, maybe a fox or raccoon. The forest was home to them after all. But then, I started to notice something odd. The sounds of the forest, which had been so calming, began to feel off. The wind started picking up, whistling through the trees in a way that didn't feel natural. The animals, which had been so active earlier, suddenly grew silent. No more birds, no more rustling in the leaves, just the wind and something else, something in the distance. I tried to shake off the creeping feeling in my chest. I was alone, but that was the point, wasn't it? I was supposed to be here for peace and quiet. But no matter how I tried to convince myself, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It was like someone or something was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked around the edge of the camp, scanning the shadows. Nothing. No eyes shining back, No movement in the bushes, just the trees swaying in the wind. But the longer I stood out there, the more uneasy I felt. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I had just arrived. I couldn't bring myself to go. I had driven so far. The thought of packing everything up and driving back in the dark made my stomach tighten. So I stayed by the fire. Night deepened. The fire crackled, but it wasn't the same. It seemed like it was struggling to stay alive. I fed it a few more logs, hoping the extra fuel would keep it going. The wind was now howling, and the sky had clouded over, hiding the stars. The temperature dropped quickly. It wasn't long before I put on a jacket, wishing I had brought something warmer. I sat there, watching the flames flicker, the wood popping and crackling as it burned. Every so often, the sound of footsteps, or at least something that sounded like footsteps, would echo through the trees. It wasn't the soft, subtle sound of animals moving through the brush. These were loud, deliberate steps, almost human. I stood up quickly, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. But there was nothing. No movement. No one in sight. I convinced myself that it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. That maybe it was a deer or some other animal making noise as it moved through the forest. After all, I had read that animals can sound like footsteps when they move through dry leaves or branches. So, I forced myself to sit back down and calm my breathing. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer, much closer. The sound of footsteps crunching in the dirt. My heart started racing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Something was out there. I wasn't imagining it. I knew it. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I grabbed the flashlight again and scanned the trees around me. There was no one in sight, but the footsteps continued, slow and steady, circling my camp. I felt the panic rise in my chest. Whoever or whatever it was toying with me. The footsteps would move closer to the edge of my campsite, then stop. Silence. Then they would move again, this time farther away, as if trying to get behind me. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, heart pounding, and backed away toward my tent. I wanted to grab my things and leave right then and there, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. The only thing I could do was keep my flashlight in my shaking hand and keep looking into the darkness. The footsteps came closer again. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, spinning with fear and confusion. I had camped alone before, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I stood there for a long time, breathing heavily, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of movement. But nothing came. The silence stretched on. The wind howled through the trees, but that was it. No more footsteps, no more sounds of anything moving. It was as if whatever had been out there, whatever had been stalking me, had just disappeared. I don't know how long I stood there in the dark, frozen in fear. Could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. My mind was racing, but there was only one thing I could think about. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another minute. The thought of packing up and driving back in the dark wasn't comforting, but staying here was worse. I grabbed my things quickly, stuffing everything into my backpack as best I could. I didn't even bother to put out the fire. I just grabbed my flashlight and headed for the truck. But just as I was about to reach the dirt road that led back to the highway, I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a shout. It was a voice, clear and calm, coming from the woods. "Don't go." I froze. My blood ran cold, and every muscle in my body locked up. The voice was distant, but it was unmistakably real. There was no one around, and yet I heard it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was pure terror. Someone had been watching me. It hadn't left, but I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't look back. I ran the whole way to my truck, threw everything into the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I drove away, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove until the forest was behind me, until the road stretched out in front of me in the quiet night. The headlights cut through the darkness, and I felt a little safer with every mile that took me farther from the campsite. When I got home, I locked the doors and sat in silence, waiting for my heart to stop pounding. I wasn't sure what had happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go camping alone again. The next morning, I checked my phone, and there was a missed call from an unknown number. I didn't recognize the area code, but something told me I didn't need to listen to the voicemail. Whatever had happened out there, whatever was following me, it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. So, I turned off my phone, packed away my camping gear, and promised myself I would never go back into those woods. And I never did. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a break from the stress of work, the noise of the city, and all the everyday chaos that just never seemed to stop. I'd been working hard lately and thought a solo camping trip in the woods would be the perfect way to disconnect, recharge, and get some peace. No phones, no distractions, just the sound of nature. I picked a spot far enough from the usual touristy campsites. I wanted something remote, quiet, somewhere I could truly be alone with my thoughts. After doing a bit of research online, I found a small, less-known area nestled deep in the woods. It wasn't exactly a popular spot, but it was listed as safe and secluded. Just what I was looking for. The drive to the trailhead was longer than I expected, twisting roads and dense forests that gave me the feeling of being far away from civilization. My car creaked and groaned as I maneuvered it along the bumpy gravel roads, and as I passed the last house on the way out, the feeling of isolation began to settle in. It wasn't an unsettling feeling exactly, just different, peaceful, but also the sort of stillness that makes you acutely aware of your surroundings. When I finally parked at the trailhead, the silence was deafening. The only sound was the rustling of leaves as a slight breeze made its way through the trees. I grabbed my backpack and started walking. It was only a 3-mile hike to the campsite, and the trail was well marked, so I wasn't worried. The hike was peaceful at first. The forest around me was thick with tall pines and oaks, and the air smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine needles. It was still early afternoon, so the sun filtered through the canopy above in patches, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant call of a bird or the rustling of something small in the underbrush, but overall it was incredibly quiet. The kind of quiet that's almost unnerving in its stillness. I set up camp near a small stream that trickled through the woods. The sound of the water was soothing, and it gave me a sense of comfort. The firewood was dry and plentiful, and as I prepared to make my meal for the evening, I couldn't help but feel a little smug about how perfect everything was going. As the evening wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the camp. I ate my dinner and then sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun set, and the night air became crisp. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and leaned back against a log, letting the crackling of the fire fill the space around me. It wasn't until the sky grew darker that I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just a sensation of being watched, or maybe just the kind of anxious feeling that creeps up on you when you're alone in the woods at night. The silence of the forest was unnerving in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't the natural silence of a remote place. It was a stillness that felt like something was missing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the feeling lingered. There was something wrong with the way the woods felt, as though they were too quiet. Usually, at night, you hear the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig as an animal moves through the brush. But here, there was nothing. No chirping insects, no scurrying creatures in the underbrush. just a deep, unnatural silence. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was probably just my nerves getting to me. Maybe I was too used to the noise of the city, and being out here alone was making me feel things I didn't normally feel. But the longer I sat by the fire, the more the unease crept in. It wasn't until I heard the first sound that I truly began to worry. It was a rustling noise, faint at first, like something moving through the brush. I stood up, straining to hear, but it stopped just as quickly as it had started. My eyes scanned the trees around me, but all I saw were dark silhouettes against the starry sky. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I could hear the crunching of leaves and twigs, and this time it didn't stop, kept going, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't the kind you hear from animals. It was too methodical, too human. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shined it into the darkness, but there was nothing there. The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows and empty space. The forest was still. The air was thick, as though the whole place was holding its breath. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just some guy hiking, maybe another camper on a different trail. There were no other campsites nearby, but maybe someone else had ventured into the woods. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but then the sound came again. This time it was closer, very close. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing in my chest. I quickly scanned the area with the flashlight, my breath shallow and quick. And that's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, standing at the tree line, was a figure, a silhouette of a person, barely visible in the shadows. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My first thought was that it had to be someone who had gotten lost, someone who had wandered too far off the trail. But why weren't they speaking? Why weren't they moving? The flashlight beam shook as I pointed it directly at the figure. The person didn't flinch. They didn't move at all. They were just standing there, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no features, just a vague shape in the darkness. I was paralyzed. I couldn't bring myself to call out. Something deep inside me told me not to. Maybe it was the strange stillness of the situation, or maybe it was instinct, but I felt that speaking would only make things worse. I slowly backed away from the fire, careful not to make any noise. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, watching. My mind raced. Should I pack up and leave? Should I run? But then what? Would I be safer out there in the dark woods? Or should I stay by the fire, where I was at least somewhat visible? I wasn't sure which option was worse. Then, out of nowhere, the figure turned and walked into the woods. No hesitation, no sound. It just melted into the darkness. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my backpack, packed everything up as quickly as I could, and doused the fire. My hands were trembling as I did it, fumbling with the straps of my bag. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I needed to get out of there. I hurried back down the trail, moving as fast as I could without falling, my heart thundering in my chest. Every step felt like an eternity. Every crack of a twig underfoot made me jump. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to feel something creeping up on me, but there was nothing. The woods were still again, almost too still. When I reached the trailhead, I didn't stop to check my car. I didn't even look back. I just threw my pack in the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped off. The further I drove, the more I started to calm down, but the dread didn't completely leave me. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the back seat or a shadow lurking at the side of the road. But nothing ever appeared. Eventually, the drive became just another drive, and the panic started to fade into exhaustion. When I finally got home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? I didn't even know what I had seen. Was it a person, an animal, or something else entirely? All I knew was that I didn't want to go back to that spot, ever. I still don't know who or what that figure was or why it was there, but I haven't gone camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. The woods were always my place of peace. At least that's what I thought. I'd been camping by myself in remote areas for years, needing that solitude, the fresh air, and the absolute silence that only a deep forest could offer. But this trip was different. I had chosen a new spot, a place I found on a map during my research. It wasn't too far from home, but far enough to feel isolated. The map didn't indicate a marked trail, but that's exactly what I wanted. No tourists, no hikers, just me and the trees. I packed light, just my tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food to last a couple of days. I parked my car at the nearest trailhead and set off on foot with my gear. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, with just a hint of moisture in the air. I had a general sense of the area's layout, but something about the feeling of being in these woods was different. It wasn't bad, just unsettling. After an hour of walking, I reached what I thought was my campsite, a small clearing surrounded by thick, dark trees. It felt peaceful at first, like any other place I had camped. The light filtered down through the canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. I set up my tent and began to prepare for the night, chopping some firewood and arranging it near the campfire ring. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, the forest began to feel quieter. The birds had stopped calling, and the wind had died down. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I wasn't sure why, but the stillness gave me a strange, unsettling feeling in my chest. Maybe it was just the isolation or the weight of the silence pressing down on me, but I felt watched. I brushed it off. I was being paranoid, I told myself. I made dinner and ate by the fire, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the darkening woods. There was something peaceful about it, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After cleaning up, I leaned back on the log I'd set by the fire and let the warmth wash over me. The night sky above me was full of stars, the kind you can only see far from city lights. It was beautiful. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound from the trees. I paused, my heart thumping just a little faster. It sounded like something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up slowly, scanning the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Nothing, just the darkness, stretching out into the woods. The sound stopped. I told myself I was being ridiculous and went back to sitting by the fire, forcing myself to relax. It's just wildlife. It's just the wind. I stayed up a little longer, watching the flames flicker and pop. Finally, the cold of the night started to settle in, and I crawled into my tent, zipping it shut behind me. The night was cold, too cold. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, but it didn't help. The chill seemed to seep into my bones, making my body ache. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to get comfortable. I finally dozed off, but it was a fitful sleep, filled with half-formed dreams of shadows and distant whispers. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The air inside the tent was suffocatingly still. I couldn't tell what time it was, but the world outside felt wrong. There was no sound at all, no wind, no rustling of leaves. I unzipped the tent slightly and poked my head out. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only a faint glow of embers. The woods were black, a void in every direction. Then I heard it again, the sound of movement, unmistakable this time. It was coming from beyond the clearing, deep in the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the gentle shuffle of a deer or the rustle of a rabbit. It was deliberate, slow, steady, and then there was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence. I pulled my head back inside the tent, my heart racing. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I spent the next hour wide awake, my mind racing. Should I leave? Was this a sign that I wasn't supposed to be here? But no, this was my trip, my time. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. I tried to force myself back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but it was brief and restless. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to the faint light of dawn creeping through the trees. The air was still cold, but the birds had begun to sing again, and the woods felt a little less oppressive. I got out of my tent, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I made coffee and ate a quick breakfast, but the atmosphere of the place still felt wrong. I didn't know what it was exactly, but something was off. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, deciding I'd hike back to my car earlier than planned. Maybe I'd take a different trail or go somewhere else. As I was loading my backpack, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around the perimeter of my campsite. They were large, too large for a typical animal, and they were fresh. I stared at them for a long time, my heart racing again. There was no way they could be from any of the animals I had seen before. The prints were too deep, too defined. My mind was spiraling now. Could someone else be out here? I checked the map again to reassure myself that this place was remote, that I was far from any well-traveled paths or roads. There was no way someone else should have been out here, especially not in the night. I packed up even faster now, the sense of urgency growing. I didn't care if I lost my spot. I just wanted to get out. I grabbed my things and headed toward the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. The trail seemed longer than it had the day before. Every rustle in the bushes made my skin crawl. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt like it was someone, or something, stepping just behind me. I pushed myself faster, adrenaline rushing through me. The woods didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore, felt like a trap. I finally came to the clearing where I had parked my car. My heart was still pounding, and the sense of dread hadn't lifted. As I walked toward my car, I noticed something even stranger. The doors were slightly ajar. The locks weren't broken, but the handles had clearly been pulled open. I froze, my stomach sinking. I had locked my car. I was sure of it. I checked inside quickly, but everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing, no obvious signs of a break-in, but the sense of violation lingered. Someone had been in my car. I left without wasting another second. The drive back home was tense, my hands gripped tightly on the wheel, and the rearview mirror never felt far enough away from the dark woods I had just left. As I got closer to the city, I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But I knew deep down the woods hadn't felt right, and I would never go back. I never liked camping, not really. The idea of being in the middle of nowhere, far from the comfort of home, always felt off to me. But when my buddy Jake insisted, I went along anyway. He'd been planning this trip for months, some random patch of wilderness off the grid, far enough from the usual trails that we wouldn't have to deal with tourists, but close enough to civilization that we could hike back to a gas station if something went wrong. The forest wasn't really my idea of a good time. There were too many variables out there, too much that could go wrong without anyone to help. But we were only supposed to be there for 2 nights, so I figured it wouldn't be so bad. Just a couple of days of hiking and chilling by the campfire. We packed our gear, a couple of tents, sleeping bags, some food, a portable stove. Nothing too fancy. As soon as we arrived, the dense trees swallowed us up. There wasn't much light in there, just streaks of sunlight breaking through the canopy high above us. The air was damp and earthy, and the smell of pine needles filled my nose as we set up camp. Jake was already in a good mood, excited for the adventure. I wasn't as thrilled, but I figured I could enjoy a couple of beers and some campfire food before we headed back. We made the usual small talk, setting up the tents and starting the fire. The first evening passed uneventfully. We sat around the fire, cracking jokes and talking about old times. But something about the forest felt off. The wind seemed to whisper, and even though the fire crackled and popped, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It's just nature, I thought. It's supposed to feel strange. Nightfall came, and we crawled into our tents, our breath visible in the chilly air. The darkness outside pressed in, and I tried to shake the creeping discomfort that was gnawing at me. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig, began to grow louder, as if the night was alive, aware of us. I tried to sleep, but the rustling outside my tent kept me awake. It wasn't the normal noises you expect from a forest. No animals skittering about, no birds fluttering by. This was different. It felt like something was moving, something big. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The noise wasn't constant. It came in fits and starts. A few steps, then silence, then more. It was like something was pacing around our campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it through the tent flap. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, just beyond the light, watching. After a long while, the sounds faded. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear. It's a wilderness area, after all. I eventually managed to fall asleep, though I didn't sleep well. The next morning, Jake was already awake, stretching and rubbing his eyes. I was still tired, the feeling of unease hanging over me. We ate breakfast in silence, the strange feeling from the night before still lingering. I didn't want to mention it. Jake would just laugh at me and call me a coward, so I kept it to myself. We spent the day hiking, pushing through dense brush and making our way up a rocky hill. The fresh air and physical exertion helped clear my mind, but by the time we got back to camp in the afternoon, the feeling was back again. Something wasn't right. That night, we built up the fire again, our shadows dancing against the trees. The sun set, and the forest seemed to close in on us. We didn't talk as much this time, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. The fire popped and crackled, but other than that, the forest felt eerily still. Too still. I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched, that whatever had been out there last night was still out there, waiting. I kept my eyes on the dark line of trees surrounding our campsite. Every rustling leaf seemed amplified. Every snap of a twig felt like a warning. After a while, we both retreated into our tents, the uneasy quiet of the forest pressing in on us. I kept the flashlight near my pillow, just in case. The night stretched on, long and heavy. The fire had burned down to embers, and the world outside seemed pitch black, without a single star in the sky. That's when I heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't clear, but it was there, faint, as if someone was whispering just beyond the firelight. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the rhythm of a voice, a human one, low and uneven. It was almost like someone was trying to speak, but the words weren't coming out right. I held my breath, listening intently. The voice stopped, but I could still hear something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving between the trees. My mind raced. It had to be another camper, right? Maybe someone else was out here, lost or wandering around. But there was no way anyone else should have been this far in. We hadn't seen another soul on our hike. I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out. The fire was nearly dead, the dark shapes of the trees looming. The forest was silent now, too silent. No animals, no wind, nothing. Just the echo of those steps, now much closer. I scanned the shadows, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. Nothing. There was no one there. I pulled my head back into the tent and zipped it up quickly. My breath was shallow, my skin cold with sweat. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. It's nothing, just an animal. Maybe a person out there, lost or disoriented. But then the footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear them, the unmistakable sound of something or someone walking slowly around the perimeter. I clenched my fists, trying to control the panic that was threatening to rise up. There was no way we could ignore this. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that we were fine, that whatever was out there, it wasn't a threat. But when I heard the breath, soft, shallow, right outside the tent, I couldn't keep it together anymore. I turned to Jake, who had been lying still, probably hearing the same sounds I was. "Jake," I whispered, "you hearing that?" No answer. I wasn't sure if he was asleep or just too scared to move. I couldn't wait anymore. I unzipped the tent again, but this time I stepped outside, heart racing. The cold air hit my skin, but I barely noticed. My flashlight swept through the trees, bouncing off the shadows. The silence was suffocating. Then there it was, a figure, just a shadow, a silhouette, moving between the trees about 30 yards from the camp. It was too tall, too thin, its movements unnatural, jerky. It wasn't human. My breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, watching it move slowly, deliberately, through the dark. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared. No sound, no rustle of leaves, nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed back into the tent, zipped it up, and tried to control my breathing. I looked at Jake, who was wide awake now, staring at me with wide eyes. He knew. He had seen it too. We didn't sleep that night. We barely spoke, our minds racing with what we had just witnessed. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we wasted no time packing up our gear. We didn't talk about the figure. There was nothing to say. We were both just ready to get out of there. We hiked out in silence, making our way back to the trailhead as quickly as we could. As we left the forest behind, the strange feeling finally started to fade, but I couldn't shake the images of what we had seen. I still don't know what it was out there. I still don't know if it was human or something else, but I'll never go camping in that spot again. Something was there, something that didn't belong, and I'm not sure I want to find out what it was. The hike had been longer than we expected. The sun was dipping behind the mountains as we made our way through the thick trees of Pine Hollow. I was getting tired, more so than I had anticipated. My backpack, heavy with camping gear, felt like it weighed a ton on my back, but I refused to stop. The trail was well marked, but the further we went, the more it felt like the woods were closing in on us. A silence hung in the air that I couldn't quite shake, something unsettling. Like we were the only ones left in the world. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Me, my cousin Ethan, and a couple of friends, Jake and Marie, decided to get out of the city and into nature for a change. We'd chosen Pine Hollow, a well-known spot for camping, with its scenic views and quiet, secluded atmosphere. We'd heard some rumors about the area, but nothing concrete, just local legends, stories people tell to add some flavor to a camping trip. Nothing that felt too real, at least not at the time. By the time we reached the clearing for our campsite, The last rays of daylight were flickering like dying embers. The campfire pit was empty, scattered with leaves. We set up quickly, each of us pitching our tents in a semicircle around the fire pit. There were no other campers around, which struck me as odd. Pine Hollow was usually packed, especially on weekends, but there was an eerie stillness. It wasn't the quiet you get in nature. It was the kind of quiet that feels wrong. Ethan, the most experienced outdoorsman of the group, started to gather firewood. I helped, though I wasn't much use with the axe. Jake and Marie, laughing and joking, unpacked their gear and set up a cooking area for dinner. I was feeling off, and it wasn't just from the long hike. Something in the air, something in the woods, seemed wrong. But I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was just tired. A little paranoia wouldn't hurt. As the fire crackled to life, we sat down around it, the warmth chasing away the chill of the evening air. Shadows flickered and danced across the trunks of the trees. The sound of crackling would fill the silence between us. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept wandering. Something about the way the shadows moved unnerved me, like they were alive, shifting just out of the corner of my vision. Around midnight, when we were all too tired to keep chatting, we decided to turn in for the night. The forest felt still, but the kind of stillness that makes you uneasy. We retreated to our tents, the sounds of the fire outside still echoing in my ears. I zipped my tent shut, double-checking the flap to make sure nothing could get in. I wasn't sure why, but I felt the need to be extra cautious. Inside the tent, I lay down, my sleeping bag warmer than the cold air outside. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the creaks and groans of the trees swaying in the wind. I must have dozed off at some point. What woke me up was the unmistakable sound of something scratching against my tent. It was soft at first, like a nail gently dragging across the fabric, but then it got louder, more insistent. My heart jumped into my throat. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, sharper this time, followed by a scraping noise that made my skin crawl. It wasn't an animal, no raccoon or squirrel. It was deliberate. I lay frozen, my mind racing. Could it be someone? I'd heard stories about people who got lost in the woods, who ended up wandering into other campers' sites, desperate for help. But the sound didn't match someone stumbling around. It was methodical, like someone or something was deliberately trying to get in. I reached for the flashlight beside my pillow and turned it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I held it up to the thin walls of the tent, but there was nothing outside. No movement, no sign of anything, just the faintest rustle in the trees above. But that could have been the wind, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I closed my eyes again and told myself it was nothing. A twig caught in the tent, maybe. A raccoon, maybe, though it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. I eventually drifted back to sleep, though the scratching noise lingered in my mind. The next morning, the sun was bright and warm, filtering through the trees, casting a peaceful glow on everything. I got out of the tent and stretched, taking in the fresh air. The others were already awake, sitting around the fire pit, brewing coffee. Jake and Marie were laughing, but I could tell Ethan was on edge. His eyes were scanning the tree line, his back stiff. He was always alert, but this was different. Something had gotten under his skin, too. I didn't say anything about the noises from the night before. I figured I was just imagining things, but I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. That day, we went on a short hike to a nearby waterfall. The area was beautiful, lush, green, with the sound of rushing water filling the air. But as we were walking back, Ethan pulled me aside, his voice low and serious. "You noticed anything weird last night?" he asked. I nodded. "You too, huh?" "Yeah," he replied. "It wasn't just the noise. Just the whole place. Something feels off. I didn't disagree. There was a heaviness to the air, a weight I couldn't explain. The trees seemed to loom larger, like they were closing in on us, and the ground felt soft beneath my boots, too soft, as though the forest was swallowing everything up, bit by bit. We didn't talk about it in front of the others. There was no need to worry them yet. That night, we built a bigger fire, hoping to stave off whatever strange feeling was creeping in. I stayed close to the fire, watching the flames dance, trying to drown out the uneasy thoughts running through my head. It wasn't long before we all grew tired again and decided to go to bed. This time, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, each shadow in the corner of my vision making my heart skip a beat. I told myself it was just fear of the unknown, the unfamiliarity of the woods. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite name. Around 3 a.m., I heard the scratching again. Only this time, it wasn't just my tent. I heard it at the others' tents too. A slow, methodical scraping came from all directions, and it wasn't just one sound. There were multiple surrounding us. I lay still, breathing heavily, my hands clenched around my flashlight. I could hear Ethan's breathing from the tent beside mine, quick and shallow, as if he was just as scared as I was. The scratching continued, growing louder, moving from tent to tent, as if something was circling us. I finally got the courage to unzip the tent and peek outside. The fire was low, the glowing embers casting a dim light across the campsite. In the farthest corner of the clearing, I saw movement, shadows shifting in the dark, too deliberate to be the wind. I grabbed my backpack and rushed to Ethan's tent. He was already out, his flashlight in hand, his face pale with fear. "We need to leave," he whispered, his voice tight. The others were awake now too, wide-eyed and scared. We quickly packed our things, each of us too scared to speak, the sounds of the forest around us growing louder. The scratching was now joined by other noises, distant thuds, the sounds of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We didn't look back as we walked away from the campsite. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, breathless and exhausted. There, we piled into the car, not saying a word, and drove away without a second glance. When we reached the nearest town, we stopped at a diner, trying to process what had happened. A waitress overheard us talking and mentioned that Pine Hollow had always had a reputation for strange occurrences. People hearing noises, feeling watched, things going missing. But no one really talked about it. Not in public, at least. I still don't know what happened that night, and part of me doesn't want to know. We made it out. That's all that matters. We never went back to Pine Hollow, and I don't think I ever will. The evening air was crisp as I stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the darkening sky. The sun had just dipped behind the mountains, leaving a soft pink and purple glow across the horizon. The last traces of daylight were vanishing quickly, and I was beginning to regret my decision to set up camp this far from civilization. My friends had warned me to be more cautious, but there was something about this place that felt different, something I couldn't quite explain. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision to go camping alone. I had heard about this remote spot up in the hills, a place that few people seemed to know about, the kind of place where you could truly disconnect from the world, a place where silence was louder than any traffic or crowds. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would help clear my mind. Now, standing in the gathering darkness with nothing but the sound of rustling leaves and distant animal calls, the whole thing felt a little off. There was no one around, no other campers, no other hikers. The woods stretched out in every direction, dense and untamed, with only a narrow trail leading deeper into the forest. I had managed to set up my tent in the late afternoon, but I still had to gather firewood for the night. The chill of the evening was beginning to bite through my jacket, and I could feel my breath growing more visible with each exhale. I had an hour or so of daylight left, but it wasn't enough to make me feel comfortable. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the silence between bird calls felt unnatural. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to head down the trail to find some wood. The path was narrow and barely discernible at times, the brush growing thick and tangled in certain spots. The sounds of the forest had changed, too. The birds that had chirped so happily earlier were now quiet, and the wind had picked up. It wasn't a gusty wind, but more of a steady breath that passed through the trees, making the leaves rustle and the branches creak. The deeper I went, the darker the woods became. The fading light of the day didn't seem to penetrate this part of the forest, as if the canopy of trees above blocked out all the remaining sunlight. I had a hard time seeing where I was stepping, and the uneven ground was starting to make my ankles sore from constantly twisting on rocks and roots. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I thought I saw something strange. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fading light, but as I stepped closer, I could see it more clearly. A pile of what looked like branches and debris, stacked unnaturally high. It wasn't the work of an animal. It was too neat, too deliberate. The pile was too uniform, like someone had stacked it intentionally. My curiosity got the best of me, and I moved closer, running my fingers over the rough bark. There was something off about the whole thing. It wasn't just the way it was stacked. It felt wrong, like the air around it had changed, becoming thicker, more oppressive. The temperature had dropped a few degrees too, or at least that's what it felt like. I quickly stepped back from the pile and looked around. The trees here seemed closer together, and the path ahead was unclear. I decided that I had enough firewood for tonight and began to turn back toward my camp. The sense of unease lingered, but I couldn't put my finger on why. My feet moved faster, and I could feel the sweat building on my brow, despite the chill in the air. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was nothing. When I finally returned to the clearing where I had set up my camp, I felt an odd sense of relief. The fire pit I had prepared earlier was still untouched, and my tent was exactly where I had left it. The world outside the clearing seemed to recede, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe again. I built a small fire and sat down, listening to the crackling of the wood as it caught flame. The warmth from the fire was comforting, and I felt my body begin to relax as the anxiety I had felt earlier slowly dissipated. The forest outside the clearing was dark and still, but the firelight created a small, warm haven in the middle of it all. I spent the next couple of hours just staring into the flames, lost in thought. The sounds of the forest seemed to have returned, though now it felt like they were coming from further away. It was almost like the world outside my little campfire was holding its breath. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and making the shadows dance in strange patterns. As the night wore on, I noticed something strange. The sounds I had heard earlier, crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl, had all but disappeared. There were no more animal calls, no more rustling in the bushes. It was as if the forest had gone silent, and the silence was starting to feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I glanced over at the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood like silent sentinels in the darkness. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual nighttime stillness that you hear when you're out camping. This was different. This was deeper, more unnerving. The hairs on the back of my neck began to prickle, and I instinctively looked toward the fire, as if its light could keep whatever was in the dark at bay. Then, without warning, I heard it, a rustling. At first, it was faint, almost like an animal brushing through the underbrush. I told myself it was just a deer or something small, but the sound was growing louder, closer. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened intently. There was something about the movement that didn't seem natural. It wasn't the usual quiet shuffle of an animal. This was heavier. It had a deliberate quality to it, like someone or something was walking through the forest trying to stay hidden. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my breathing, but I could feel the panic rising. The forest around me felt different now, like it was closing in. I scanned the shadows near the tree line, but all I could see were the shapes of the trunks and the thick brush. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Felt like the woods were waiting. I didn't know what to do. I considered packing up and leaving, but it was too late. The night was too far gone, and I had no idea how long it would take to hike back down the trail, especially in the dark. I thought about calling for help, but I had no signal. This area was too remote for any kind of reception. The rustling started again, this time closer. My heart hammered in my chest as I shined the flashlight into the trees, but all I saw was the deep black of the forest. I was starting to feel the full weight of my isolation. I was alone, completely alone, and I was getting the feeling that something out here was aware of that. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The sound of the rustling stopped again, and this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the skin on the back of my neck crawling. My eyes darted back and forth between the shadows. Every part of me screamed to run, but I knew I couldn't. I couldn't leave my camp, my tent, my gear, unattended. I didn't know what was out there, but I didn't want to face it unprepared. The fire crackled loudly, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the trees near the edge of the clearing, a figure just beyond the reach of the light. It was too quick to make out, but I was sure I had seen something. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. I froze. They were coming closer. I had never been one to shy away from adventure, and this camping trip had been something I'd been looking forward to for months. The whole idea of getting away from the noise of the city, spending time in the wilderness, just breathing in the fresh, pine-scented air, seemed like the perfect escape. There's something about nature that always brings me a sense of calm, or at least it used to. I'd packed my gear a couple of days ahead of time, making sure to double-check everything. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, extra clothes, a few books, the usual. I didn't think there would be any problems. I even made a quick list of things to bring for safety: a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a decent map of the area. The last thing I wanted was to get lost in some remote wilderness without the proper tools. The drive out to the campground was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you start noticing every little thing around you. The creaking of the car, the occasional chirp of a bird, the swaying of trees. I tried not to think about how far from civilization I was. The thought that I was heading deeper into the forest made me slightly uneasy, but I ignored it. It was just a little camping trip, after all. When I arrived, the place was nearly empty. Just one or two other tents scattered around, each a few hundred feet away. I liked that. Peaceful. No noisy neighbors, no loud kids. Just me, the trees, and the sky. I pulled my car into one of the spots near the clearing, and I got to work setting up the tent. As I worked, I couldn't shake a feeling that something was off. It wasn't a sharp, clear feeling of danger, but more like a vague discomfort, the kind you get when you feel like you're being watched. I glanced around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just trees. I chalked it up to my nerves and finished setting up the tent. After that, I started gathering some firewood. The sun was still high, but I figured I'd want a fire later, just to add to the atmosphere. As I walked through the woods collecting logs, I noticed something strange. The air had changed. It wasn't as fresh as it had been earlier. There was a strange heaviness to it, like something was dampening the natural sense of the forest. I stopped, looking around. There was no reason for it to feel so oppressive, but it did. I told myself it was just a shift in the weather. When I returned to camp, I decided to ignore my unease and start cooking. I made a simple meal, something light, just enough to fill me up after the drive. I ate in silence, watching the shadows stretch as the sun began to set behind the trees. The campfire crackled, and I could hear distant sounds: the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the chirp of insects. It wasn't until the night fully settled in that things started to feel wrong. I was sitting by the fire, lost in thought, when I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a branch rubbing against another, but the sound was too rhythmic, almost like footsteps. Not in the distance, but close, way too close. My heart rate picked up as I tried to focus. I didn't see anyone, but the sound continued, just outside the reach of the firelight. I tried to ignore it. The forest is full of sounds, after all. Animals move around at night, and the wind can play tricks with your ears. But this wasn't like the usual noises. It was deliberate, slow, almost too careful. I decided to stay put, just listening. The noises stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then they started again. Louder now, closer. I could hear something moving through the brush. Something large, moving steadily in a way that felt unnatural. That's when I started to get really uneasy. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, shining it in the direction of the noise. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, catching on the trees and the underbrush. Nothing, but the sound continued, now circling my campsite, moving from one side to the other, like whatever it was knew I was watching. I sat there, frozen, heart pounding in my chest, listening to the movement. I wanted to run, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the fire. It felt like whatever was out there was waiting for me to make a move. I gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam of light shaking in my hand. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. For a long time, I just sat there, not daring to move. The fire crackled. The wind sighed through the trees, but that was all. The forest felt alive in a way that I wasn't used to. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt wrong. I stood up slowly, scanning the shadows around me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what could have been out there. I couldn't see anything, but something in my gut told me I wasn't alone. I decided to get into the tent. The fire was still going strong, and it wasn't like I could just leave, but at least in the tent, I'd feel safer. Inside the tent, I sat on the sleeping bag, trying to steady my breathing. My eyes kept darting to the entrance, half expecting someone or something to appear. It wasn't until I heard a sound outside the tent, a low rustle that was unmistakable, that I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. The noise was louder this time, accompanied by the faint sound of something dragging across the ground, something heavy. I had to force myself to remain calm. Whatever it was waiting, watching. I reached for my phone, but the signal was non-existent. I cursed under my breath. The one thing I had thought would be reliable was useless out here. Another noise. This one was closer, right outside the tent. I pressed myself against the wall of the tent, holding my breath. The sound of something moving, dragging itself through the underbrush, stopped. I didn't hear a thing for a few moments, and for a split second, I thought it had gone away. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps came again, much too slow for comfort. Then, a rustling, a snap of a twig. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and, without thinking, unzipped the tent. I swung the beam wildly in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing. Nothing except the blackness of the forest. The beam of light flickered as I panned it across the trees, the leaves, the shadows. Nothing. I stood there, feeling the chill of the night air on my skin, trying to gather my bearings. The forest seemed to mock me, silent and still, like it was waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay out here in the open, but I didn't want to go back into the tent either. The footsteps stopped. For a while, everything was completely still. And then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a figure moved in the darkness. It was tall, hunched over, and it didn't walk like an animal. It moved in a way that seemed too deliberate, too human, but not quite. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I froze. The figure moved, getting closer. I took a step back, my heart racing. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to get in the car and leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring into the dark, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the trees, vanishing without a sound. I waited and waited. Finally, I managed to find my legs again. I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up. The silence that followed was overwhelming. My mind raced. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was human or animal, but the way it moved, the way it stayed just out of reach, I knew I had to leave. But how? How could I leave in the middle of the night when whatever it was out there was waiting? I didn't sleep. The whole night, I lay there in the dark, staring at the walls of the tent, listening for the faintest sound, waiting for it to come back. The next morning, the sun rose over the trees, casting a golden light over the campsite. The air smelled fresh again, like nothing had happened, like everything was normal. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, looking around, half expecting to see signs of something, anything, that could explain what I had experienced. But there was nothing. The forest was still, silent, peaceful. I packed up my things quickly. I didn't look back at the spot where I had seen the figure. I didn't want to. I just wanted to get out of there, to drive away and leave the woods behind. When I reached the car, I looked around one last time. There was nothing but the trees, the clearing, and the road that led back to civilization. But in my gut, I knew it hadn't been just my imagination. Whatever had been out there was real, and maybe it was still out there, waiting. I didn't stay for another minute. I got in my car and left the campsite, leaving the unsettling silence of the woods behind me. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really escaped, that something was following me, and maybe it always would. I had always been someone who loved the outdoors. Growing up, I'd spend every weekend hiking, camping, or just exploring the woods. There was something calming about being out there, surrounded by trees and the sound of nature. The world felt simpler, quieter. It was just me, the woods, and the sounds of my own thoughts. But that weekend changed everything. That was the time when things went wrong, and my entire perception of the woods, and maybe even reality itself, shifted. It started with a camping trip I had planned with a couple of friends. We'd all agreed to go out into the mountains, away from the busy city life, and spend the weekend roughing it in a remote part of the forest. The place was called Pine Hollow, a secluded area that was known for its silence. No roads, no phones, just nature. I had never been there before, but I trusted my friend Dan, who had camped there a few times before. He described it as peaceful, beautiful, and the perfect escape from everything. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The air cool, but not too cold. The sun was setting in the distance, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. There were 3 of us, me, Dan, and Sarah. We all carried our gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, and enough firewood to last the night. We hiked in for about a mile, following a narrow trail that twisted through dense trees. The farther we went, the more isolated it felt. We hadn't seen another soul for hours, and the path grew more and more rugged. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that we decided to set up camp. First, everything was normal. We set up the tents and got a fire going, laughing, joking, and enjoying the quiet of the forest. The sound of the fire crackling, the wind rustling through the trees. It was soothing, almost hypnotic. We made some food, sat around the fire, and let the darkness surround us. The night was perfectly still, the kind of stillness you only find in places untouched by human hands. But as the night went on, something felt off. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. It's easy to feel uneasy when you're out in the middle of nowhere. But there was something about the way the air felt. Too heavy, too still. I noticed it when I stepped away from the fire for a moment to use the bathroom. The forest felt wrong. It wasn't like the forests I was used to. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive, almost suffocating. I quickly returned to the fire, hoping to shake the feeling. The others were still sitting there, talking about random things, but I couldn't quite get rid of the sensation that something wasn't right. I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was the darkness, or maybe I was just tired. Either way, I needed to relax. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and the temperature was dropping. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, pulling my sleeping bag around me. As I lay there, trying to drift off to sleep, I heard something. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A twig snapped. It was faint, but it was there. I wasn't sure if it was just the wind or an animal, but it sounded too deliberate, too intentional. I held my breath, listening. Another snap, closer this time. I didn't dare move. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or something small, but the sound of it kept getting closer. It was almost like something was circling our camp. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a bear, though I had been told bears weren't common in this area. Or maybe it was something else, something I didn't want to think about. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it through the thin fabric of the tent. I didn't want to look outside, but I couldn't stop myself. My heart pounded as the beam swept across the darkness. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just my imagination or a small animal doing its thing. I turned off the flashlight and pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, hoping to get some rest. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. Soft steps moving around. Too careful, too deliberate. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the inside of my tent, listening to the noises outside. The occasional snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves. I knew I wasn't alone out there, but I didn't know who or what it was. I finally decided I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I needed to check on Dan and Sarah. Maybe they heard the same noises and were just as freaked out as I was. I unzipped my tent carefully, trying not to make any noise, and crawled out into the cold night air. The campfire was barely aglow now, just a few embers smoldering. Dan's and Sarah's tents were both quiet. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I should wake them. But the feeling of being watched, the feeling that something was just beyond the trees, made me hesitate. I couldn't shake it off. Something was wrong. I moved closer to the fire, looking around the clearing. The darkness pressed in, but I didn't see anything. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, there it was again, a snap, this time much closer. It was so loud, I felt it reverberate in my chest. I froze. From the shadows, something moved. I saw a figure, a shape that didn't quite make sense. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it moved in jerky motions, like it was trying to remain unseen but didn't care enough to hide completely. It wasn't human. The way it stood, the way it moved, it didn't belong there. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran. I don't know how far I ran or how long I ran for. My feet were sore, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away from whatever that thing was. I found myself back on the trail, running in the dark with no real direction, just the instinct to get away from the camp, from that thing that was following me. Eventually, I slowed down. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? No, I couldn't have. I saw something. It was real. I stumbled into a small clearing, out of breath and terrified. I had no idea where I was. I didn't recognize anything, not the trees or the rock formations. I had no idea if I was even on the right trail anymore. My head spun with panic. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and this time much closer. I turned around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. I felt the presence again, just out of sight, watching me. I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I pushed myself forward, weaving through the trees, tripping on roots and rocks. But the footsteps never stopped. They were always there, just behind me, just close enough to send a chill up my spine. Then, as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. It was dead quiet. I stood still, listening. Nothing, not a sound. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but when nothing else happened, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. Maybe it had gone away. Maybe it was just a bad dream or a trick of the mind. I kept walking, this time with purpose. I had to find my way back to the camp. I couldn't leave my friends out there. I had to go back. I had to make sure they were safe. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I found a familiar trail marker. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but I recognized it. It was one of the small, reflective signs Dan had mentioned. I followed it, relief flooding over me. When I got back to the clearing, the camp was still empty. Dan and Sarah's tents were still standing, but there was no sign of either of them.
No footprints.
No nothing. It was like they had never been there at all. Panic set in. I shouted their names, running through the clearing, but the forest remained silent. It felt wrong, like I was in a place where no one had ever been before. I ran back to where I had last seen them, to the fire pit. Still nothing, no trace of them. And then, as I turned to leave the clearing again, something caught my eye. A small, shiny object glinting in the darkness near the edge of the trees. It was a piece of one of their backpacks. A small strap, torn and discarded. That's when I realized whatever I had seen, whatever had been following me, wasn't just hunting me. It was hunting us all. I didn't stay any longer. I left everything behind, running back to the trailhead, and didn't stop until I reached the main road. I flagged down a car, and I begged the driver to take me back to town. When the authorities finally arrived, there was no sign of Dan or Sarah. Their tents, their bags, their food, all of it was untouched. They simply disappeared without a trace. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know what I saw or what followed me, but I do know one thing. The forest has its own rules. It doesn't like to be disturbed. And once it's noticed you, it doesn't let go. You might not see it, but it's watching, waiting for the right moment. It's been years since that night, but I still haven't gone back into the woods. I don't think I ever will. I had always been one to enjoy the peace of nature, the quiet hum of trees swaying in the wind, the smell of damp soil, the occasional rustle of a distant animal. It was all something I found comforting. So when a friend suggested we go camping in a secluded forest, I thought, why not? A weekend in the woods would be the perfect escape from the noise of city life. We set out early on Friday morning, the sun still low in the sky, painting everything with a golden hue. The drive was long, but the roads were clear. My friend, Jake, was driving, and I had no complaints. I preferred to just watch the scenery pass by. We talked about random things, the usual banter that made time feel like it was moving quickly. The excitement of getting to the campsite kept my mind occupied, so I didn't think much about the fact that the place was so far from anything familiar. When we finally reached the forest, we parked at a small clearing near the trailhead. The trees were tall and dense, their trunks thick with age, and the air smelled fresh, like earth and pine. Jake pulled out the map, but I could already tell the campsite was a few miles in. There were no other cars, no signs of life. It felt remote, but that was exactly what we wanted. As we started our hike, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The further we walked into the forest, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves and the occasional call of birds overhead. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. The hike itself wasn't particularly strenuous, but it felt like it was taking longer than I had expected. By the time we arrived at the campsite, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. There were no other campers around, just the two of us and the vast, empty woods. We set up our tent, pitched it under a large oak tree, and started a fire. The crackling of the wood was comforting, and the heat of the flames pushed back against the growing chill of the evening. Jake was talking about something, but I wasn't really listening. My attention kept drifting, drawn to the edge of the forest. There was something about the way the trees stood so still, like they were waiting for something. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the wind moving the branches. But no breeze was stirring, and yet the leaves shifted. I kept my eyes on the fire. As night settled in, the stars appeared above us, bright and clear. It was so dark, the kind of darkness that only exists in places far removed from the city. There were no streetlights here, no headlights from passing cars. The only light was the fire, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of burning wood and the distant hoot of an owl. "Hey, I'm going to check the perimeter," Jake said, suddenly standing up. "Make sure there's nothing around here." I looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean? Like an animal?" "Just making sure. You never know." He grabbed his flashlight and disappeared into the dark. I sat there, staring into the fire. My eyes were starting to adjust to the darkness, and that strange feeling, the one I had been trying to ignore, was coming back. It was as though the forest was pressing in, like something unseen was watching. I kept telling myself it was nothing. There were no ghosts or monsters in the woods, just trees and animals. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and glanced over at the spot where Jake had gone. There was no sign of him. I knew he was just taking his time, but something felt wrong. I stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just the soft sway of branches in the wind. Then I heard it, a sound. Faint at first, but it grew louder. A crackling noise, like dry leaves crunching underfoot. But it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was moving in the woods, and they were close. I froze, listening harder. The sound stopped, then resumed. Footsteps, but they were far too heavy to be an animal. I backed up slowly, feeling my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest, once so quiet, now seemed alive with movement. I spun around, but still no sign of Jake. I called out, but my voice sounded small against the vastness of the trees. "Jake!" Nothing. The footsteps continued, closer now. I turned back to the fire, my mind racing. I had to stay calm. It was probably just another camper or some animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too human. Suddenly, the flashlight beam caught something. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was impossible to make out any details, just the outline of a person, too still, too silent. My heart skipped a beat. "Jake!" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Then, a rustling sound behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight scanning the area. No one. But the footsteps were still there, getting closer. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Something was wrong. something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I grabbed the nearest stick and raised it, my hand trembling. Whatever was out there wasn't playing games. I had to protect myself, even if it meant facing whatever was out there alone. The steps were now mere feet away. I could hear breathing. Someone was close, way too close. I turned in every direction, expecting to see Jake or some other camper, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. Then, just as suddenly as the sound started, it stopped. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening.
No footsteps. No rustling.
Nothing. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around. There, standing in the shadow of the oak tree, was Jake. His face pale, eyes wide with fear. "I heard something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I just grabbed him by the arm and pulled him toward the tent. "We need to leave. Now." Jake looked at me, confused. "What's going on?" "We're not staying here," I said urgently, grabbing the backpack. I didn't care about the tent or the fire anymore. There was something in those woods, something that had been watching us, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what. We didn't waste time. We grabbed everything we could carry and ran back to the trailhead. No looking back. The forest felt alive with movement, every rustle of the leaves making me jump. It felt as if the trees themselves were closing in on us, like the forest was alive with things that wanted us gone. By the time we reached the car, I was out of breath, my legs sore from the rushed escape. I didn't care about the dark or the long drive back. I just needed to be away from the woods. We drove through the night, not saying a word. The headlights cut through the darkness, and with every mile, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. By the time we were back in the city, I could finally breathe again. We didn't speak much after that, but we didn't need to. The look on Jake's face said it all. We never went back to that forest. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, the woods, and a little bit of peace. I needed to get away from the noise, the constant rush of life, and just let nature do what it does best. Make everything quiet again. So I packed up my gear and drove about 3 hours north to a campsite that had a good reputation. The kind of place where people go to get away from the world, to reset. No cell service. Just you, the forest, and the stars. I arrived in the early afternoon, just as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The camp was already quiet, with only a couple of tents set up in the distance. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, it was what I came for. The air had that crisp, earthy smell that makes you feel grounded, like you've just returned to where you're supposed to be. I took a deep breath, grabbed my pack, and walked toward the area where I was planning to set up my tent. The campground was in a small, secluded valley surrounded by tall trees, most of them pines and oaks, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. There was a creek nearby, which I could hear faintly in the distance, its soft murmur giving the place a serene kind of ambience. The ground was covered in thick moss, and there were traces of animal tracks in the mud near the creek bed. A part of me felt a little thrill seeing those tracks, proof that I was really in the wild. I found a nice spot, set up my tent, and started gathering wood for a fire. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and I could feel the temperature beginning to dip. There were no other campers nearby, at least none I could see, but I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, even if it was a bit eerie. The quiet was heavy, but peaceful. By the time the fire was going and I was sitting next to it, the sky was dark. The warmth of the flames contrasted sharply with the cold, damp air creeping in. It was a bit unsettling to be out there all alone, but I tried not to let my mind wander to anything too weird. This was supposed to be my escape after all. The sound of crackling wood was comforting, and I focused on the simplicity of it. Just fire, the woods, and me. Then the silence hit. It wasn't the kind of silence you get when everything is still. It was a strange, oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. The fire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed almost too sharp against the blackness of the forest. I shifted on the log I was sitting on, my eyes scanning the darkness, half expecting something to move. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. The forest around me, which had seemed so inviting just hours earlier, now felt off. A strange sense of being watched washed over me, like I wasn't alone despite the obvious emptiness. I stood up and walked around the campfire, trying to shake off the feeling. I checked the perimeter of my camp. Nothing. It was just the forest. But still, my skin crawled. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was nearby. The noise came suddenly, sharp and loud, cutting through the air like a scream. A branch snapped somewhere in the woods behind me. My heart stopped. I froze, staring into the dark trees, trying to make sense of the sound. I stood there for a few moments, too tense to move, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing. No more movement, no more sounds. I convinced myself that it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe a squirrel even. Whatever it was, it couldn't be anything dangerous. After all, there was nothing out here but nature. I was safe. I went back to the campfire, trying to distract myself by poking at the logs. The crackle of the fire made me feel a little better, but that odd, watchful feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the idea that something was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. Night settled in deeper. The moon was high now, casting its cold light across the forest, and the temperature dropped even more. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and sat back down, trying to focus on the fire, but the unsettling feeling never left. A few hours later, after I had eaten and cleaned up, I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. The cold air felt sharper now that I was inside. I could hear the creek running steadily in the distance, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Everything should have been peaceful, but my mind was racing. Then it happened again. A sound, a twig snapping. This time it was closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound of leaves crunching followed, like someone or something was walking slowly, deliberately around the campsite. I tried to convince myself it was an animal again. Maybe a bear or a large bird, something passing by. But this felt different. The movements were too deliberate, too calculated. I could feel my heart begin to race. The sound stopped. Everything went silent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the inside of the tent, willing myself to fall asleep, telling myself I was just being paranoid. There was nothing out there. It was just a bad feeling. I was overthinking it, but deep down I knew I wasn't. I knew something was wrong. I knew someone or something was watching me. I stayed still for what felt like hours, just listening. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on me. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of nature earlier, was eerily still. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, thudding louder with every passing second. The silence was suffocating. Eventually, I heard it again. This time, it was right outside my tent. The unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs, the sound of something moving slowly around my campsite. I froze, trying not to breathe too loudly. I was trapped in my tent, with no way out. I couldn't stay in there any longer. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get away from whatever was out there. I slowly unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound, and slipped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I grabbed my flashlight from the ground, shining it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shapes lurking in the shadows, just the endless blackness of the woods. But I could still feel it, the presence. It was there, watching. I started walking slowly at first, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, but I needed to put some distance between me and whatever had been circling my camp. Every step I took, the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor seemed deafening, like I was screaming into the night. I walked for what felt like miles, keeping my flashlight pointed to the ground to avoid tripping on roots or rocks. The trees around me grew thicker, more oppressive, like they were closing in. The feeling of being watched intensified, making my skin prickle. Then, just as I thought I might be getting away, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. This time it was coming from ahead of me. Something was moving through the trees, following me. No longer behind, but right in front. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew I couldn't outrun whoever or whatever was out there. I wasn't even sure what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get to safety. I needed to get to the car. I turned around and began running, not caring about the noise I was making now. I pushed through the trees, tripping over roots and scrambling over rocks. My breath was ragged, and my heart pounded in my chest. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, like whoever was chasing me was gaining on me. The car. It was the only thing in my mind now. I had to get to the car. I finally broke through the edge of the woods, and I saw it. My car parked just a few hundred yards away. I sprinted toward it, my body burning with exhaustion. As I neared the car, I heard the footsteps stop. No more crunching, no more movement. I dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook as I put the car into gear, tearing out of the campsite, my headlights cutting through the trees. I didn't look back. The drive back to civilization felt like a blur. I kept expecting to see headlights in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing. No one following me. The woods were just that, woods, empty, silent, and vast. I didn't know what had been out there. I didn't want to know. Maybe it was someone else camping, maybe just a couple of hikers who got too close to my camp. Maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, I was never going back there. By the time I reached home, the sun was rising, and the tension in my body finally started to ease. I don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. Sometimes the woods don't want you there. And sometimes, when you're alone, it's better not to know what's watching you. It was supposed to be a normal camping trip, just a weekend in the woods. I didn't expect anything unusual, just some fresh air, time away from my phone, and a chance to clear my mind. The idea was simple. I'd hike into the forest, set up camp by a lake, and maybe catch a fish or two. Nothing more, nothing less. But what happened during those 2 days is still something I can't shake off, and I'll never look at the woods the same way again. I set out on a Friday afternoon. The weather had been perfect all week. Clear skies, warm temperatures. It was everything you'd want for a peaceful weekend in nature. I drove my car to a remote campground about an hour outside the nearest town. There were only a few cars parked in the lot when I arrived, which I took as a sign that I'd have the place mostly to myself. Perfect. I grabbed my gear from the trunk and set off down a narrow trail toward the lake. The woods weren't dense at first, just a scattering of trees and the occasional low bush. The air smelled fresh, and I could hear the gentle rustling of leaves as a light breeze moved through the branches. I kept my eyes on the path, but I noticed a few odd things here and there. A broken branch on the ground, a patch of dirt that looked disturbed, as though someone had recently walked through it. Nothing too strange, but enough to catch my attention. The trail wound around a few bends, and before long, the trees became thicker, blocking out more of the sunlight. I wasn't sure how long I'd been walking, but I could feel my legs starting to tire. The sound of running water reached my ears, and I smiled, knowing the lake wasn't far off now. After a few more minutes, the trees opened up, and I found myself at the edge of a small, serene lake. The water was still, like a mirror reflecting the sky. I breathed in deeply, soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. I picked a spot on the shore, far enough from the other campers to have some privacy but still close enough to the water for fishing. Setting up my tent was easy, and I was soon settled in. I spent the next couple of hours getting the campfire ready, gathering wood, and enjoying the quiet solitude. The sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It felt good to be away from everything. No phone, no emails, just the sounds of nature. As evening approached, I thought about going for a quick walk around the lake before dark. The woods had a calming effect on me, but at the same time, there was something about them that felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the way the trees seemed to grow closer together as the light faded. I shrugged it off and decided to go for the walk anyway. The path around the lake was narrow but well-worn, and I followed it for a while, breathing in the cool air. The ground was soft underfoot, with pine needles cushioning each step. But then something caught my eye. It was a shape in the distance, just a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees. I paused, staring at it. My first thought was that it was another camper, maybe someone else who had arrived late and was taking a walk like me. But as I watched, the figure didn't move. It was too still, too rigid, and there was something wrong about it. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look, but before I could make any sense of it, the figure vanished into the woods. I blinked, unsure if I had actually seen something or if my mind had played tricks on me. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should go check it out, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I turned around and headed back to the camp, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a shadow, a trick of the fading light. But my mind kept replaying the scene, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that it hadn't been a trick. It had been something else, someone else. I stayed close to the fire that night, not wanting to go to sleep with the strange feeling lingering in the air. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the cool night sky. I tried to relax, but every little noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent, pulling the flap closed and wrapping myself in my sleeping bag. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night passed slowly. At least it felt like it did. I kept waking up every few hours, convinced I heard something outside. Each time, I'd listen, straining my ears to hear the slightest noise. But nothing came. I convinced myself it was just the wind or animals moving through the woods, and eventually, I managed to get a few hours of solid sleep. When I woke up the next morning, it was still early. The sun had barely risen, and the world outside was still shrouded in mist. I crawled out of the tent, stretching, feeling the stiffness in my muscles from yesterday's hike. I was thirsty, so I grabbed my water bottle and headed toward the lake to refill it. As I walked along the shore, the mist hung low over the water, making everything feel dreamlike. But then something caught my eye. Just a few feet from the edge of the lake, there was a small pile of stones, carefully stacked on top of each other, forming a small cairn. I stared at it for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. I hadn't seen it the day before, and it was too perfectly stacked to have been made by animals. Someone had put it there. I crouched down, studying the cairn. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right with me. I reached out to touch it, but just as my fingers were about to make contact, A sudden noise behind me made me freeze. It was a crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I turned around quickly, my pulse racing, but there was no one there. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I stood up and looked around, my eyes scanning the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was someone or something out there in the woods waiting. But again, there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I decided to finish filling my water bottle and head back to camp. But as I turned, I noticed something else. A set of footprints in the soft mud near the water's edge. They were fresh, barely visible, and they led straight toward the pile of stones. I felt my stomach drop. These weren't my footprints. I hadn't seen anyone else around the lake since I'd arrived, and the tracks didn't look like they came from anyone hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The unease I'd felt the night before had grown into something more intense, more dangerous. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I went back to camp, packed up my things, and left as quickly as I could. I didn't look back. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But nothing, just the empty road behind me. To this day, I still don't know who or what I saw in those woods. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. And I'll never go camping alone again. I wasn't sure why I agreed to go camping that weekend. It wasn't even my idea. My friend Jason had mentioned it a couple of times, but I just thought it would be like any other camping trip. The kind of trip where you pack up your gear, drive to some random forest, and just unwind for a couple of days. That's what I thought it would be. But of course it wasn't. The drive up to Wild Hollow was a lot longer than I expected. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and the trees were dense, with their thick trunks creating a nearly unbroken wall of green. The kind of forest where the sunlight barely reached the ground. I could feel the isolation in my bones. Jason had insisted on taking the back roads, saying it would be more peaceful and less crowded. I didn't care much for the quiet, but I didn't mind the chance to get away from work for a while. I could feel the stress of city life melting away as we turned onto the narrow dirt path that would take us deeper into the woods. It was almost eerie, the way the trees closed in around us, blocking out the sun more and more with each mile. When we reached the campgrounds, there was no one else around. The site was abandoned, as if everyone had just packed up and left. The tents we were supposed to set up were the only signs of life. We set up camp near a small creek that ran through the area. The sound of the water was soothing at first, and it helped to drown out the silence. After the tents were up, we started a fire. The flames flickered and danced, sending shadows creeping along the trees. The woods around us felt so still, unnaturally still. It wasn't like any other camping trip I had ever been on. There was something about the air that felt thick, as if it was holding its breath. Jason and I sat around the fire, talking about nothing in particular. But every so often, I would glance around, feeling like something was watching me. It wasn't a feeling I could explain, just this nagging sense that the woods were alive in some way. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, the trees, my mind playing tricks. It wasn't until the sun started setting that things began to feel off. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, longer, more stretched out. The air got colder, even though it was still early summer. Jason didn't seem to notice. He was too busy fiddling with the fire, adding another log. I decided to get up and walk around a bit, just to stretch my legs. As I walked further into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trees seemed to close in around me even more as I moved farther from camp. The branches swayed, but there was no wind. It was unnerving, like the forest was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. The smell of damp earth, pine needles, and decay filled my nostrils. I turned to go back to camp, but something caught my eye. A shadow, just a flicker in the corner of my vision. I froze. The shadow didn't move like it should have. It didn't follow the natural flow of the wind, and it didn't match the rest of the forest shadows. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but as I continued walking back, my steps quickened. My heart began to race. I heard a twig snap behind me, like something heavy was moving through the underbrush. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, just the quiet. I hurried back to the camp, where Jason was sitting by the fire roasting marshmallows. I didn't mention anything about the strange feeling in the woods. He wouldn't have understood anyway. Jason was the type who thrived on adventure. Me, I preferred the safety of familiarity. But even as I sat back down by the fire, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim glow over the campsite. I kept hearing noises from the woods, branches cracking, leaves rustling, the sound of something moving. It didn't sound like animals. It sounded too deliberate, too calculated. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent's roof, listening to the strange sounds outside. I tried to ignore it, but as the hours wore on, the noises became louder, closer. I could hear heavy breathing, the sound of someone, walking just outside the edge of the camp. It was getting to the point where I was certain something, or someone, was lurking just beyond the firelight, watching us. I got up quietly, making sure not to disturb Jason. I unzipped the tent cautiously, the cold air hitting me immediately. I stood there, scanning the dark woods around me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear nothing now, but I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Something was out there. I stepped out of the tent and walked toward the edge of the campsite, where the trees met the clearing. Every nerve in my body was on edge, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The night was still, too still, and it felt like the woods were waiting for something. Then I heard it, faint rustling, then more movement. It was coming from the trees, the underbrush just a few feet from the campsite. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The noise stopped, but the feeling of dread only intensified. I moved back toward the tent, slowly, but the moment I was halfway there, the sound started up again, louder now, as though whatever it was had been following me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, but I couldn't form a plan. I grabbed the flashlight by the entrance of the tent and flicked it on, pointing the beam toward the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but I saw nothing. Nothing but trees, just the forest. I breathed a little easier, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That feeling that someone, was waiting just beyond my sight, watching, listening. I ran back into the tent and zipped it up. I lay there in the dark, still hearing those sounds, feeling the weight of the night pressing in on me. Jason didn't wake up, even though I was sure he had to have heard it too. Maybe he just didn't care, or maybe he was too deep in his own world to be bothered. I spent the rest of the night awake, lying there, staring at the roof of the tent. The sounds stopped for a while, but they came back again and again. And each time they got closer. It felt like something or someone was circling our campsite, like it was studying us, waiting for the right moment to make its move. By morning, I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. Jason was up early, making coffee and cracking jokes about how I'd never survive in the wild. I didn't have the energy to argue or even to explain what had happened during the night. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, not saying much. I could still hear the noises in the woods, but they were fainter now, as though the thing that had been stalking us had retreated back into the forest. We didn't stick around. Jason seemed disappointed, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. The drive back was quiet. No words, just the sound of the car engine and the road beneath the tires. It wasn't until we were halfway home that Jason turned to me, a puzzled expression on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half laughing. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. I could still hear the rustling in my mind, the heavy footsteps following me. Whatever it was that had been in those woods, it wasn't something I could explain. But it was real, and I wasn't going back there again. And the thing is, I never have, not even once, because every time I think about it, I can still hear those footsteps, just out of sight, waiting to return. I never thought camping could be so terrifying. I've been out in the woods countless times before, with friends, family, or even by myself. The peace, the solitude, the silence. It's always been something I found comforting. But this time, I learned the woods aren't as inviting as they seem. It started like any other camping trip. I spent the whole week planning it, packing my gear, making sure I had everything. It wasn't going to be some fancy trip. No cabins or expensive amenities. Just a tent, some supplies, and the kind of adventure I'd enjoyed since I was a kid. This was supposed to be my escape from the stress of work. A simple, calming weekend in nature. I chose a spot in the middle of the forest. It wasn't a popular camping site, which I liked. It was remote, hidden from any major trails, and that gave me a sense of peace. The kind of peace you get when you're alone, away from the noise of the world. I set up camp early in the afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. The air was fresh, the wind light but steady, and the trees loomed high around me, their branches whispering in the breeze. It wasn't until dusk started to fall that I began to feel something wasn't quite right. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of doubt in the back of my mind. Something in the air felt heavy. It wasn't the usual peace I'd expected. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the newness of the spot, the unfamiliarity. I spent the evening making a small fire, roasting marshmallows, and watching the sky turn dark. The crackle of the flames was soothing, and the night felt just like any other camping trip. But as the fire died down, and the stars started to blink into the sky, I felt that strange feeling again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker in my mind, it was real. The woods around me were quieter than they should have been. No animals, no wind rustling through the leaves, just a strange silence, so deep it felt unnatural. I told myself it was just the quiet of the night, but something kept nagging at me. I poked at the fire, trying to push away the unsettling thoughts. Maybe it was because I was alone, or maybe because I hadn't camped here before. I grabbed my flashlight, made sure the food was safely stashed in my bag, and settled into my tent for the night. The canvas of the tent felt like it was closing in on me, but I dismissed it as anxiety. I turned off the flashlight and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. A rustling sound, slow, deliberate, not the kind of thing that a small animal makes. The noise was heavy, purposeful. My heart started racing. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the wind or an animal, but the rustling continued, slowly getting closer to my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. It stopped right outside my tent. I felt my pulse thundering in my ears. It was too quiet now. I could hear every little sound, every shift of my own body as I lay frozen in place. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the fabric of the tent, felt suffocating. I wanted to get up, to check outside, but I didn't dare move. The minutes stretched on, and then I heard it, a deep, slow breath. It wasn't from an animal. It was from something else, something human. My blood ran cold. The breath lingered, almost like it was waiting for me to make a sound, to give away my position. I felt the air grow thick with tension. There was no way to mistake it now. Something was out there, deliberately stalking me. I lay perfectly still, my hand gripping the flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. I couldn't risk giving away my position. The noise outside was gone now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there. Watching, the hours dragged on and sleep never came. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. Could it be a bear? A wild animal? I told myself that it must have been. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The movement was too calculated, too slow. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped carefully out of the tent, and scanned the area. The forest was eerily still, the trees casting long shadows in the soft morning light. No sign of anything, no tracks, no broken branches. Still, the feeling of dread lingered, and I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. I decided to pack up early. Something wasn't right, and I had no intention of staying another night to find out what. I worked quickly, rolling up my tent, shoving everything back into my pack. But as I was tying the last strap of my bag, I froze. There was something in the distance, standing between two trees just outside the edge of the clearing. A figure. It was tall, unmoving, just standing there, its shape barely visible in the shadows of the trees. I should have run. I should have done something, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, watching as the figure slowly tilted its head, like it was studying me. The silence returned, but this time it felt even heavier. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting for me to react, to make the first move. I knew, in that moment, that whatever it wasn't a bear or some wild animal. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with unnatural speed. It was like it hadn't even been there, like it melted into the forest itself. I don't remember packing up the rest of my things. The next thing I knew, I was walking quickly down the trail, my heart pounding, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't stop until I was out of the woods, back in the town. I felt like I could breathe again, but the memory of that figure, of the way it moved, still haunts me. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't even know if I'll ever go camping again. The woods are vast, and the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, is something I'll never forget. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't some wild animal. Whatever it was human, or at least it looked human. I don't know who or what it was, but I don't think I want to know. It's been months since that trip, and every time I think about it, the dread comes back. But I have one thing that gives me peace. When I finally got to the nearest town, I checked my phone. The signal had come back. I had a message. It was from a friend of mine who had gone camping there a few weeks before. The message was short, just a few words. _ don't go back to that spot. Trust me. _ I don't know who sent it, but I'm glad I didn't go back, and I don't think I ever will. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. After months of stressful work and constant noise in the city, I needed a break. I decided to go solo, something I hadn't done in a long time. The plan was simple. Spend a weekend in the wilderness, disconnect from everything, and just enjoy the quiet. No distractions, no people, just me, my tent, and the forest. I picked a spot on a remote trail, far enough from the usual campgrounds. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude. The hike up was difficult, especially carrying all my gear, but the moment I set up my tent and looked around, it was worth it. Tall trees surrounded me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was fresh and clean, something I hadn't experienced in ages. I set up my campfire, started to cook my dinner, and looked at the sun sinking behind the horizon. Felt perfect. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, listened to the crackling wood, and watched the stars slowly appear. The forest seemed alive, but in a peaceful way. There were rustling leaves and distant animal calls, but nothing that felt threatening. After finishing my dinner, I lay in my tent, the warmth from the fire still on my skin. The sounds of the night were calming, and eventually, I drifted to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. I hadn't planned anything too strenuous, so I decided to take a leisurely walk through the woods. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the world was bathed in a soft, golden light. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and my map and set out on the trail. It wasn't too hard to follow, and I enjoyed the silence, the only noise being my footsteps and the occasional bird call. But then, as I walked further into the forest, I started to feel off. At first, it was nothing major, just a slight unease like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, convinced it was my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods. It's easy to start feeling paranoid when you're isolated like that. I continued on, but the feeling didn't fade. The trees here were thicker, the trail less obvious. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was just behind me. I stopped, took a deep breath, and tried to calm myself. It's just the wilderness, I told myself. There's no reason to be scared. I pressed on, but things started to get stranger. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. There were no more birds, no rustling animals. It was as though the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. And then I saw it, a small clearing ahead. The trees opened up into a patch of grass and wildflowers. I moved toward it, eager for a change of scenery. But as I stepped into the clearing, my heart stopped. There, lying in the grass, was a backpack. It was old, worn out, and looked like it had been there for a long time. It wasn't like a normal hiking bag. It had that sense of abandonment, like whoever had left it there had walked off and never come back. My curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously approached it. I knelt down beside the bag, unzipped it slowly, and froze. Inside was a collection of items that made my stomach churn. A few worn maps, some dried-out food, a flashlight with no batteries, and a blood-stained jacket. I picked up the jacket carefully, not knowing what to think. The blood was dark, dried into the fabric. My hands shook, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. Whoever had left this behind wasn't coming back. I stood up, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of there. I turned around quickly, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was far enough that I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy outline of a person, standing perfectly still. I couldn't see their face, couldn't see anything but the shape of them. My heart thudded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I didn't move. I just stared, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. But the figure didn't move either. It was like they were waiting for something. The forest was still deathly still. The wind had stopped, and the usual sounds of the wilderness had faded away. The figure, though far, felt wrong. I didn't know how to explain it. It was as if it didn't belong. The silence stretched on, and I felt a growing panic in my chest. I forced myself to turn and move, slowly at first, but then faster, my legs pumping as I hurried back toward the trail. I didn't look back, couldn't. The further I went, the more I felt a sense of urgency. My pace quickened, my feet slipping on the uneven ground as I rushed to put distance between myself and that figure. My mind raced, thinking of every possibility. Someone else out here, a hiker, a lost camper, or something worse. I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail again. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It felt as though that figure was still out there, hidden in the trees, waiting for me. I made my way back to camp, my nerves on edge the entire time. When I reached my tent, I didn't feel any safer. I sat by the fire, the flames crackling as if mocking my fear. The night came quickly, the sky turning dark. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something was off. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing motionless in the clearing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made my heart race. The crackling of the fire, the wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch. All of it seemed to carry more weight, more meaning. I kept checking the shadows, half expecting to see someone lurking just beyond the firelight. Around midnight, I heard a noise, something soft, like footsteps on the ground. They were close, too close. My blood ran cold as I sat up, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps stopped. It was like the person, if it was a person, had noticed that I was awake. I reached for my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent. The outside world was pitch black, the only light coming from the dim embers of the dying fire. I scanned the area around me, my heart pounding, but I saw nothing. The forest was still again, but this time it felt like it was waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed alert, listening to every sound, but nothing else happened. When morning came, I packed up quickly, eager to leave that place behind. My nerves were shot, and I just wanted to get back to civilization. The hike down was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. But when I finally reached the parking lot, the sense of danger eased. I was back in the real world where things made sense. As I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed something strange, something I hadn't seen before. On the back of my car, there was a small piece of paper tucked under the wiper blade. I hesitated, but I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a note, written in hurried, jagged handwriting. Asterisk, you were close. Watch your back. Asterisk, the blood drained from my face. I didn't know who had left that note or what it meant, but one thing was certain. I wasn't alone in those woods, and whoever had been watching me was still out there. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt like I had barely escaped something. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but I didn't want to find out. That camping trip was the last one I would take alone, and I would never go back to those woods. The feeling of being watched, the figure in the clearing, and the note, it all haunted me. Even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, somewhere, was still watching. I don't know who left the note or what their intentions were, but I do know one thing for sure. I'll never forget that trip, and I'll never trust the woods again. I've always loved the outdoors. I used to camp with friends when I was younger, and I've spent countless nights in the woods, staring up at the stars, listening to the rustling of the trees, and feeling that deep sense of peace. But this trip was different. Something about it didn't feel right from the start, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. It started off like any other camping trip. A small group of us, me, my buddy Nick, and a couple of other guys, decided to camp out in a remote area in the Appalachian foothills. It wasn't a well-known site, which is exactly what we wanted. We were looking for something off the beaten path, away from the noise and the crowds. We were experienced hikers and campers, all in our late 20s, used to spending nights in the wilderness. Nothing was going to go wrong, or so we thought. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, and all the usual gear: food, water, a couple of flashlights, and of course, a portable stove to cook on. The weather forecast said it would be clear skies with a chance of a light breeze. Perfect for a few nights under the stars. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon. The woods were dense, thick with trees that blocked out much of the sunlight, casting the forest floor in shadow. The ground was soft, covered in a blanket of dead leaves and pine needles. We chose a spot near a creek that flowed gently over rocks, its sound adding to the calming atmosphere. The air smelled of fresh earth, pine, and something sweet I couldn't quite place. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, we set up camp, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and we talked about everything and nothing. Our jobs, our past trips, stupid things we had done. As night fully fell, the forest became eerily silent. The usual nighttime noises, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl were strangely absent. Even the wind had stopped. That's when I first started to feel it. At first, I thought it was just me being paranoid, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I glanced around, trying to see past the firelight into the darkness, but it was like the forest was holding its breath. I kept my eyes on the trees, on the shadows that seemed to move and shift, and that uneasy feeling grew stronger. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Nick looked at me from across the fire, his face a little pale. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, not trusting my voice to be steady. "Yeah, it's too quiet." He glanced around, then stood up, walking a few paces toward the tree line. "It's probably just the wind picking up, man. It's fine." I didn't feel fine, though, and that's when I noticed something odd. There was something wrong with the shadows, too deep, too long. They didn't move like they should. There was no breeze, but I could swear the shadows were shifting as though something was walking just outside of the firelight. "Hey, you okay?" Nick called, snapping me out of my thoughts. He was standing by the tree line, looking out into the darkness, but his body was tense, like he was on edge. "Yeah, just keep an eye out, okay?" I said, trying to shake the chill running up my spine. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. After a bit, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, trying to push the uneasy feeling from my mind. I laid there in the dark, listening to the sound of the creek, the occasional crack of a twig in the distance, and then nothing. No wind, no rustling, just silence. That's when I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustling of leaves. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but it was too deliberate, too slow. It was close, too close for comfort. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear any sound that might explain it. But all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. It stopped, but only for a moment. Then came the crunching sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, unmistakable. Someone or something was walking near our camp. I waited for Nick to say something, but the silence stretched out. I crept out of my sleeping bag, heart hammering in my chest, and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The fire was still going strong, but the shadows were deep and moving again, like something was passing in and out of the light. My pulse quickened. I didn't know if it was the wind, but the movement seemed too purposeful, too deliberate. I slowly slid back into my bag and lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Minutes felt like hours. The footsteps continued, slow, like something was circling the camp. It was only when I heard a faint rustle directly outside my tent that I froze completely. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but it didn't. There was something out there, something watching. Eventually, I heard Nick's voice, low but urgent. "Dude, do you hear that?" I didn't answer. I just lay there, completely still, not sure what to do next. The rustling outside continued, and then a sudden cracking sound echoed through the trees. Something or someone had stepped on a branch. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and stuck my head out just enough to get a view. The fire was still burning, but the light flickered in strange patterns, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. There, near the edge of the camp, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, person, standing still in the shadows, watching us. The figure didn't move. It was just there, staring into the campfire like it was waiting for something. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. I quickly ducked back into my tent, trying to steady my breath, my mind racing. Who was it? And why hadn't they said anything? They couldn't have just wandered in from nowhere. The nearest trail was miles away. I knew I had to wake the others. I was about to get up when I heard it. Footsteps again. Not from the figure, but from somewhere behind the camp, coming closer. The crunching of dry leaves and twigs, slow and deliberate. Whatever was happening, we weren't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, then my phone, and quickly texted Nick. Asterisk, get up. There's someone out there. Asterisk, the reply came instantly. Asterisk, I know. I can hear them too. Asterisk, that was when the panic set in. We weren't just dealing with an intruder or a lost hiker. This was something different, something wrong. Decided to pack up and leave, but as we made our way toward the fire, the footsteps grew louder. They were circling us now, closing in from all sides. We couldn't see anything, but we could feel the presence. The air was thick with tension. Suddenly, the sound of a branch breaking nearby sent us all into a scramble. In the chaos, Nick shouted for us to run, but we couldn't see a way out. The trees seemed to close in, blocking the path. We had no choice but to stand our ground, and I heard a rustling noise from the opposite side of the clearing. I can't tell you how long we stood there, hearts racing, wondering if something would emerge from the dark. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. We waited, not knowing what to expect, when, finally, a voice shouted from the trees. A voice I recognized. Hey, you guys okay? It was Tom, another one of our group, who had taken a different trail earlier that day. Relief flooded over me, so intense that I almost collapsed. We hadn't been alone after all. But Tom's appearance didn't explain everything that had happened. There was still that feeling, that oppressive weight in the air, like something had been watching us the entire time. When we finally made it back to the truck, I was physically and mentally exhausted. We drove out of the forest, the headlights cutting through the dark trees behind us. And as we left, the strange feeling faded. We didn't speak about it much on the ride home. The tension was too much. We never went back to that spot again. And the memory, that feeling of being watched, stayed with me long after we left. There was something out there, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Or maybe, just maybe, the forest had its own secrets. I've always been the type who preferred solitude in nature. There's something about the smell of the forest, earthy, fresh, and raw, that calms me. A week ago, I decided to take a few days off from everything. No phone, no work, just a simple camping trip by myself. The plan was to head deep into a national park I'd been to before, but this time I was aiming for an isolated, lesser-known spot. I packed my gear, double-checked everything, and set off early in the morning. The drive was peaceful, just me and the open road. My truck hummed along. The highway stretched out ahead like a ribbon. I didn't need music. The sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional bird passing overhead were more than enough. After a couple of hours, I turned off the main road, bouncing over the rougher, less traveled paths. As I got deeper into the park, the trees grew thicker, and the noise of the outside world seemed to fade. My only company was the occasional animal darting out from the underbrush or the soft rustle of wind in the branches above. It felt like I was entering a different world, one where I could forget about everything. The trailhead was easy to find, a little sign wedged between two massive pine trees. Deep Creek Loop, it read. I had hiked this trail before, but I'd never ventured this far in. The path was narrow, mostly dirt with occasional rocks and roots poking through. As I grabbed my backpack from the truck, I couldn't help but feel a small spark of excitement. This was it, the kind of adventure I'd been craving. I started walking, the familiar crunch of my boots on the path comforting. The sun was high in the sky, dappling through the leaves above. I moved at a steady pace, my mind wandering from thoughts of work and responsibilities to the simple, raw beauty around me. There were no other hikers in sight, no noise except the occasional bird call or the distant rush of water from a nearby creek. A couple of hours into the hike, I reached a small clearing near a stream. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. I had everything I needed: my tent, sleeping bag, stove, and food. As I set up, the weight of my decisions, the pressure of life outside the woods, seemed to lift. I was content. By the time the tent was up and the fire pit was arranged, the sun was dipping low and the forest felt alive in a new way. The temperature had dropped significantly and the cool night air began to bite. The sky was cloudless, a perfect canvas of stars. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, the only light for miles around. The crackling of the wood and the snap of the fire made me feel like I was part of something larger, something ancient. As night fell, the forest grew darker, the sounds of the wildlife more distinct. The occasional rustle in the bushes, the call of an owl, the far-off howl of a coyote. I didn't feel scared, but there was a certain alertness to the quiet, the kind of awareness you only get when you're alone in a place where anything could be lurking in the shadows. I cooked a simple meal, a can of beans heated over the fire, and ate it slowly, savoring the solitude. Afterward, I cleaned up, stashing everything in my pack, and sat back down by the fire to enjoy the stillness. That's when I heard it, a soft crunching noise, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, my mind immediately jumping to the most logical explanation. A deer, maybe, or another animal wandering too close. But the sound came again, closer this time. I listened intently, my body stiffening. It was faint but distinct. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods nearby. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't entirely alone out here, but I hadn't expected anyone to be camping this far in. I hadn't passed another hiker for hours. I stood up, my instincts taking over. Quietly, I grabbed my flashlight and crept a few feet toward the noise. The forest around me seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I didn't see anything. Nothing was moving. The sound had stopped, too. I stood there for a moment, just listening. The air was thick, as if holding its breath. When the rustling didn't return, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal after all. Still, my unease lingered. I returned to my fire, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I wasn't exactly a rookie when it came to camping, but something about the silence in the air made me uneasy. I sat down again, the fire crackling louder than before. It was then that I noticed the stillness. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No more rustling, no more owl calls, no coyotes. Just the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, too. The next few hours felt endless. I tried to push the feeling out of my mind, telling myself I was overreacting. I'd be fine. It was probably just a deer or some other wildlife. Nothing to worry about. But the longer the silence stretched, the more uneasy I became. I I kept telling myself that it was normal for the woods to grow quiet at night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the quiet that was making me uncomfortable. I glanced over my shoulder again, but the trees remained still, unbroken by any movement. Eventually, I lay down in my tent, pulling the sleeping bag around me. I kept the flaps slightly open, not enough for anyone to see in, but enough to hear if anything approached. The last thing I wanted was to sleep with the unsettling feeling of being watched. As I lay there, listening to the night, I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't quite grasp. I must have drifted off to sleep, though, because when I woke up again, the fire had died down to embers, and the sky was a deep black, with only the faintest glimmer of moonlight. That's when I heard it again. The same crunching sound, faint but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the creek, a little farther off than before. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just lay there, listening. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone walking through the woods, careful not to make too much noise. Whoever or whatever it wasn't in a hurry. I stayed still, not daring to move or make a sound. My heart was thudding in my chest. Every part of me screamed to get up, pack up, and leave right then. But I didn't. I didn't want to give in to whatever was out there, whatever was trying to get my attention. The crunching grew louder, closer. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Silence again. I stayed in the tent, my mind racing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. What was going on? Was it a person or was it an animal? I didn't know, and that was what scared me most. The next morning, I woke up early, the first light of day just beginning to break through the trees. I packed up quickly, keeping my senses sharp, looking over my shoulder as I moved. The forest seemed much more welcoming in the light, but I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. The hike out felt different. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle in the brush, had me looking around, my senses on edge. I wasn't sure what had happened the night before, but something didn't sit right with me. I wasn't paranoid, I told myself, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached my truck, I was relieved. It had been a long, strange night, and as I drove out of the park, I could feel my shoulders relax. The tension in the pit of my stomach slowly started to fade. I'd made it out, and I wasn't going to think too much about what had happened in the woods. I probably never know. The drive home felt long, but safe. The highway was familiar, the noise of traffic a welcome contrast to the quiet of the forest. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but no one ever did. Eventually, I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of home, the quiet of my neighborhood. It felt good. I was safe. But even now, as I sit here writing this, there's something I can't shake. The feeling. It wasn't just the quiet of the forest or the strange noises. It wasn't just the isolation. It was something else. And I wonder sometimes if it's still out there.